Ванька, встанька, що таке? Приготуй собі пакет. Ванька, встанька, не біжи, вже немає куди йти. Ванька, встанька, що таке? Приготуй собі пакет. Ванька, встанька, не біжи, вже немає куди йти. Не сховатися нікому, то хіба що по приколу. Морем болем іде козак, то для вас недобрий знак. Раз, два, три, чотири, п'ять, вам нема куди тікать. Раз, два, три, чотири, п'ять, наш козак іде шукать.
Hello my friends, today we're going to take a deeper look at the reason why the Freemasons are extremely obsessed with revenge on Russia. This is going on since 250 years, since the Tsar Alexander I and before him Catherine II banned Freemasonry. And this was ongoing until like the end of the Soviet Union.
Grekiske guden Hermes gick redan på sin första levnadsdag ut ur sin grotta i Arkadien för att stjäla 50 kor från sin halvbror Apollon. För att vilseleda brodern ledde Hermes korna baklänges. Utanför grottan träffade han på en sköldpadda som han slog ihjäl, varpå han spände några fårtarmar över skölden och så uppfann lyran. Och de kom överens om att Apollon skulle få det underbara instrumentet. Apollon skänkte honom dessutom en gyllene bevingad stav, omslingrad av 2 ormar, vilken blev hans attribut. Hermes stal Zeus spira, Poseidons vackra treudd och Afrodites gördel. Han blev bedragarnas och tjuvarnas gud.
So here we have an article by Leo Sagami. I'm gonna read it. The name of the article is Unprecedented Clash Between Ukrainian and Russian Freemasonry and the Secrets of Russian Freemasonry. Interviewed by the Italian news agency ADN Kronos, the Grand Master of the Lodge of Ukraine, Anatoly Dimchuk, said that traditionally as Masons we cannot support war, tyranny, moral and physical violence. It is impossible on a metaphysical level. We, the Freemasons of Ukraine, actively fight against it.
Slingar har i strävan efter rikedom och makt gillrat otaliga ideologiska och politiska fällor i livets labyrint, för att människan inte skulle genomskåda den bedrägliga tillvaro hon lever i. Därför är det uppenbart att även de frimurarkrafter som lockade många människor in i kommunismens fällor behöver allt skydd från skojarnas gud Hermes för att bevara kommunismens hemligheter. Liksom Hermes använder dagens demagoger retorik för att bedra och vilseleda allmänheten. Därför kan man säga att alla ideologiska och politiska lurendrejerier
So this next text is from freemasonry.bci.ca. Freemasonry in Russia. From the Grand Orient of France in Russia to the Supreme Council of the Grand Orient of Russia's people. By Mr. Andrei Prihain, Moscow, Russia. Freemasonry in Russia has undergone 3 distinct stages prior to the events detailed in this paper. First, from 1731 to 1771, membership was confined to foreigners, a few officers, the guard, and a few statesmen. So they only had a few statesmen back then. According to Albert Mackey, the tendency was mystical and the influence on society naturally negligible. So we have a paraphrasing here by Leo Sagami. The official date of the appearance of Masonic lodges is considered to be in the middle of the 17th century, although some researchers believe that secret organizations began to develop in the territory of Russia as early as the 1731. Peter I and his associates Franz Lefort and Patrick Gordon are named among the founders of Freemasonry in the Russian state. In 1750, the Grand Master of the Great London Lodge, Lord Lovell, appointed Captain John Phillips as the provincial Grand Master for the Russian state. So this is from freemasonry.network. In view of the current situation, it is worth recalling the history and presence of Freemasonry in Ukraine. On a record, the first lodge of Three Brothers was created in the village of Wisniewka in Volhynia by 1742 by Polish noblemen. In Lvov, the first lodge of Three Goddesses appeared in 1758 as part of Austro-Hungary. The first lodge in Malorossia, or the Russian Empire, was established in Kiev in 1784 by Russian officers. So we have to remember that Kiev was always at the center of Russia for a very long time, as was Ukraine. One of the members of that lodge, which was named Besmerty, was Grigory Skovoroda. I'm sorry, I'm butchering these Russian names. The lodge was created eventually after the first partition of Poland. The next year, 1784, three lodges have appeared in Kremenchuk: Mars, Dobry Pastur, and Minerva. The last one, Minerva, was transferred to the Dnieper banks from the city of Podoli Nemirev. It is known that the Freemasonry existed in Kharkov, Vinnytsia, Yekerotsnalav, and Berdichev, and others. Later, from the 1780s to 1790s, coupled lodges existed in each of the following cities of Dubno, Kremenchuk, and Zhytomyr, and Kiev. So they note here, Tri Colony was created in 1993. In the 19th century, the popularity of them only increased throughout the Ukraine. In the Sloboda Ukraine existed the lodge Palitsinska Academia. I'm sorry, I'm butchering this again. Palitsinska Academia. The Malorussian Secret Brotherhood was created by Vladimir Lukashchev and sought the independence of Ukraine. Also was connected with Freemasonry movement that continued to spread rapidly. In Kharkov, the most famous was the lodge Umirayoschi Sphinx, Dying Sphinx, that was created sometime after 1764 when Kharkov was visited by a Moscow University professor Viganda. In 1822, Alexander I issued an order prohibiting Freemasonry, and it seemed that it will stop. However, the movement since then went simply underground. On September the 24th, 2005, in Paris, in the Grand Temple of the Grand National Lodge of France, together with the Grand Lodge of Austria, consecrated the Grand Lodge of Ukraine GLU. At present, 14 lodges are operating under the jurisdiction of the Grand Lodge of Ukraine. In Ukraine, lodges work in the following cities: Kiev, Lvov, Odessa, Ivano-Frankivsk, Drohobych, I can't read this, Zaporizhia, Kharkov, and Chernivtsi. So we can see that since 2005, Freemasonry has grown in Ukraine, and with this also the transatlantic bonds and the continuation of, this spider web, which then, eventually brought the country to its knees because the Freemasons have this ancient or 250 years old feud against the Russians, against the Russian people, not against, like Russian ideology. They don't care what kind of ideology you have. If they are against you, then they are against you, and they will do everything to destroy you. That's what they do. I'm reading from the 2006 Kellerman lecture for NSW and ACT, published in ANZMRC Proceedings in 2006. Catherine the Great and Freemasonry in Russia by Robert Nayern. Introduction. Madariaga gives her opinion that nowhere else in Europe did Freemasonry play such a significant role in the development of cultural life of 3 or 4 generations as it did in Russia. However, whatever Freemasonry did for Russia, the history of Freemasonry itself is turbulent, as is shown below. It started about 1730 during the reign of Peter the Great, was voluntarily closed by Catherine II in 1794. The ban was confirmed by Paul I in 1796. It grew again, but banned once more under Alexander I in 1822. Ban confirmed by Nicholas I in 1826, started again in 1905 under Nikolai II, did not survive long after the Bolshevik Revolution 1917, and started again in 1995. So, let's hone in on Catherine and Freemasonry. Early Freemasonry in Russia. The earliest reliable information about Russian Freemasonry is a record of a session of the Grand Lodge of England, dated 24th June 1731, regarding at the appointment of Captain John Phillips as Provincial Grand Master of Russia and Germany in 1731, but it is not known if he founded any lodges there. Regular Freemasonry in Russia really began when Lord James Keefe was made Provincial Grand Master for Russia on the 28th March in 1740 by the Grand Lodge of England, although Masonry initially only embraced expatriates. In 1756, the first truly Russian lodge, the Lodge of Silence, was consecrated in St. Petersburg. The members of this lodge included many men who later became famous. Alexander Petrovich Sumarokov, an author, Prince Sherbatov, a historian, Dmitriev Mamonov, a philosopher, Prince Dashkov, Prince Golitsyn, and Prince Trubetskoy and Prince Meshersky. In addition to the English rite, which Catherine apparently found quite acceptable, different orders and rites of Freemasonry in Russia soon began to proliferate. In 1762, the Templar Rite of Milesius, consisting of higher orders. In 1765, the Strict Observance Rite, which is the Swedish rite, I think. And in 1765, the Zinendorf system, a Christian order from Germany.
Between 1731 and 1822, that's kind of the early golden age of Freemasonry in Russia. And you have to understand that Russian Freemasonry went through 3 distinct phases during this time period. Starting in 1731 and up to about the mid 1760s, early 1760s, Freemasonry was really a product by foreigners for foreigners. So you had
The Empress Catherine, it must be said, was never an avid supporter of Freemasonry. In her own words, Freemasonry numbers among mankind's greatest errors. How can they restrain from laughter when they meet each other? Through the middle of the 1780s, Catherine herself wrote 3 plays, The Deceiver, The Deceived, and The Siberian Shaman, which were sharply critical of Freemasonry on the basis of its purportedly deceptive character and connection to charlatans like Cagliostro. These early criticisms did not go so far as to question the political loyalty of the Freemasons, whose members professed loyalty to the monarchy and who occupied high positions within the Empress's government.
Now, starting in the in the early reign of Catherine the Great, as we'll see in 1762, Freemasonry morphed into its own as members of the Russian aristocracy, members of the Russian intelligentsia, started joining in droves. And this is where Freemasonry really morphed from just being a simple byproduct of foreign influence on Russia to its own style of Freemasonry, really modeled after the English speculative style, which is that system of morality, again, getting to that speculative nature of Freemasonry that came about in England at 1717 at the birth of the Grand Lodge of England, and primarily working those 3 degrees. Then, getting into the 1780s, you had the higher degree mystical Masonry based heavily on Rosicrucianism. And this is where we start to see splintering factions in Freemasonry, which tend to confuse a lot of people as far as the craft is concerned. And you'll see that some of this splintering and some of this infighting between their own version of the neo-moderns and neo-ancients in Freemasonry ultimately led to its downfall and banning. So the Grand Lodge of Russia, as we know it today, was formed in 1995 after the collapse of the Soviet Union and December of 1991. But Freemasonry has existed off and on, like I've mentioned, in Russia for 286 years. But in order to set the stage for Freemasonry, we actually have to talk about one of its leaders starting in 1672, and that's Peter I, also known as Peter the Great. And he came to the throne as the Tsar of Russia, the king or regent of Russia, at age 10 in 1682, but jointly ruled with his half-brother Ivan V, who history records as chronically ill and of infirm mind until about 1696. Now, there's a legend that Peter the Great was the first Russian Mason who actually took the degrees with Christopher Wren during his travels to England. And of course, we don't have any historical information to either confirm nor deny that. However, we do know that Peter the Great traveled very, very prolifically throughout Northern Europe for the first several years of his reign, because Peter was very influenced by Western Europe and its preoccupation with the Enlightenment. So Peter saw the Russian society, which originated out of the Slav tribes and had some Mongol influences from their 13th century invasion of most of Russia.
When Paul I came to the throne, he initially supported Masonry, but quickly changed his mind once he became a Tsar, largely out of fear over the French Revolution and the alleged Masons' role in it. He outlawed the fraternity in 1796 along with all other suspected secret societies in the country. The Order of Freemasons became a quasi-forbidden thing in Russia. Even in the period of the Golden Age of Russian Freemasonry from 1810 to 1822, the lodges were under strict surveillance by the Special Office of the Ministry of Home Affairs. Speculative Masonry was originally brought to Russia in the early part of the 18th century by foreign officers in service to the Russian military, and Catherine the Great's factotum Ivan Yelagin succeeded in reorganizing Russian Freemasonry into a far-reaching nationwide system and secured at the same time the English authorization for the first regular Russian Grand Lodge, becoming also its provincial Grand Master. According to Albert Mackey, the tendency was mystical and the influence on society negligible. Russia was later recognized also as the 8th autonomous province of the right of strict observance, but after the French Revolution, anti-Masonic measures started to creep in. It was after the French Revolution, as well as a schism developed between the lodges of Moscow, dominated by the strict observance, and St. Petersburg, ruled instead by the Swedish Rite. In the meantime, Catherine the Great, the last reigning Empress of Russia from 1762 till 1796, and the country's longest ruling female leader, suspected that the Masons had turned her son Paul against her. becoming a tool in the hands of her main enemy, the King of Prussia, and viewed their attitude towards women as backwards. Catherine the Great. Catherine, or Ekaterina, married Grand Peter Freudian slip there. Grand Duke Peter in 1745 as a young bride, only to find him at least temporarily impotent, so she could not fulfill the role that would make her, a German, most secure, that of mothering an heir to the throne. The marriage rapidly deteriorated. It is alleged that the Empress Elizabeth urged her to have an affair, with the result that her firstborn, Paul, later Paul I, was said to have been fathered by Catherine's first lover, Grigory Orlov. However, Catherine records in her memoirs that Madame Choklokova urged the affair, no doubt on behalf of the Empress, and it is more likely that Paul was fathered by Count Serge Saltykov. She records her peek at him missing a tryst because he was dragged by Count Roman Vorontsov to a meeting of Freemasons. End quote. Paul was nevertheless raised as Peter III's son and heir, but was taken from Catherine soon after birth by Elizabeth, so Catherine had a few chances to rear him, although she supervised his education. It was alleged that her daughter Anna was sired by Count Poniatowski.
So its connection to Western Europe, as far as Freemasonry is concerned, has been both the strongest reason for Freemasonry's existence in Russia, but also its greatest detriment.
The situation began to deteriorate, however, when word spread that the leadership of the Moscow Masons, by then commonly called Martinists or Rosicrucians, had made repeated efforts to convince the Grand Duke Paul, Catherine's son and heir apparent, to join their brotherhood. Paul repeatedly had been put forward as a suitable male replacement for the Empress, with opposition to Catherine, and even rebels like Pugachev coalescing around the idea of Paul replacing Catherine before her death. With a royal patron, and hopefully future ruler, at the helm of their order, the Moscow Masons perhaps hoped to circumvent the suspicion and criticism of Masonry generated by Catherine and her court in St. Petersburg. While archival documentation of Paul's Masonic affiliation remains scant, the perception of courting his influence and participation was enough to arouse suspicion. The Moscow Masons' attempt at securing patronage and linking that patron to a foreign power through an opaque and secretive hierarchy would link Freemasonry fatally with subversion in the eyes of its critics. The rapidly escalating situation in revolutionary France was the
inquiries into Freemasonry, Freemasons meeting under the watch of the police, things of that nature. So as we go through this today, you're going to see a definite pattern of Freemasonry being successful and then being not successful in direct proportion to the Russian people's relationship or conception of their relationship with the West.
One of the investigators, Platon, a favorite and lover of Catherine's, who has been trying, she had a lot of lovers, was trying to consolidate his power at court, listed 23 of Novikov's books, which he believed sought to introduce religious error. Although Novikov survived the subsequent investigation, the books were banned, although not on political but on religious grounds. As a result, and also due to a subsequent argument with Novikov, Catherine determined not to renew Novikov's lease on the Moscow University Press when it should expire in 1789. Novikov further angered Catherine by criticizing the Jesuits in 1784, accusing them of being a political order, and portrayed them as faithless, power-seeking, aiming to set up a state within a state. Catherine sided with the Jesuits. She closed down the Masonic printing presses, and finally Moscow authorities had Novikov arrested in 1792. However, her attitude to Freemasonry had already changed to contempt following the visit of the fraudulent Italian Count Cogliostro, who allegedly tried to recruit her into his form of Egyptian Masonry, which included healing, seances, alchemical experiments, magic displays, and also included women as members. She wrote several plays ridiculing the craft in which Freemasons were presented as promising their victims philosophical goals, the elixir of life, and contact with the world of spirits, as Cagliostro has done. The attacks were not limited to Novikov, but included other Russian Freemasons, such as Alexander Nikolaevich Radistchev, who wrote that it is argued to be the first anti-Tsarist book, A Journey from St. Petersburg to Moscow, which incensed Catherine. He was sentenced to death, but this later commuted to exile in Siberia. He, like Novikov, was later pardoned by Paul. The reasons for Catherine's turning against the craft. It seems odd that Catherine should suppress a group supportingly loyal to the sovereign and teaching morality and a belief in God, and one whose members held prominent positions in her cabinet, who had done so much for the enlightenment of Russia. But Freemasonry had involuntarily become associated with personal enemies of the Empress. First, her husband Peter III had allegedly been a member of the craft, and Catherine was suspicious of anybody who might have been loyal to him. Freemasons in Russia had the support of her son, Grand Duke Paul, who became an enemy of the Empress and became a Mason. Some of the Russian Freemasons were aligned to Germany and Frederick the Great of Prussia, who was an enemy of Catherine's Russia. The Empress, who had been offended when Gustavus of Sweden attacked her school program, and some lodges were of the Swedish Rite. The Empress wanted overall control of everything in Russia and was suspicious of anything controlled from outside its borders. Novikov's Freemasonry was opposed by and opposed to the Jesuits, who were Catherine's favorites. Novikov's Freemasons were also opposed to the French Enlightenment because a part of French Freemasonry was agnostic and opposed to the Church, but Catherine looked to France for cultural stimulation. Novikov's religious publications angered the churches, which Catherine had to placate. Novikov's charity and feminine relief was believed to be for ulterior political purposes, and the fraudulent Count Cagliostro's brand of Freemasonry created ridicule. The 19th century. So in 1996, Catherine died, Ekaterina died. Paul was killed in a palace revolution in 1801, and his son Alexander I, who had been largely educated by Catherine, but had grown in her later years to abhor the immorality and court favoritism under her reign, ascended to the throne. It is reported that evidence exists that Alexander became a Mason in 1803 and was a member of a lodge in Warsaw, Poland. Masonic lodges were officially allowed in 1810, and new lodges appeared in St. Petersburg and Moscow, and also in Siberia and the Crimea. Freemasonry spread rapidly, but by 1815 another break occurred. Some lodges retained as adherents to the Swedish system and supported the Provincial Grand Lodge of Sweden, but the majority of lodges united in a new Grand Lodge Austria, which was formed in 1820 with 24 lodges. This Grand Lodge was formed with many different rituals: an English rite, a Zinnendorf rite from Germany, a strict observant Sweden rite, and Fessler's modified English rite. The deputy Grand Master was Lieutenant Igor Kushelev, who sought to unify the lodges under the Swedish rite without success. Eventually, in 1821, in frustration, he wrote seeking a solution to the Emperor Alexander. However, the Spanish Rebellion of 1820 and the mutiny of Semenovsky Guard Regiment in the same year had unsettled Alexander, and he came to the conclusion that secret societies could not be tolerated, so he enacted a ban in 1822. Although there were several attempts to resurrect Freemasonry, The ban was confirmed by Nicholas I in 1826 following the Septembrist Revolution in 1825, and Freemasonry ceased to exist in Russia until the early 20th century. So, next chapter, Freemasonry under Catherine. In this environment, it is hardly surprising that Freemasonry initially flourished in Russia under her rule. In 1772, Yelagin, a court favorite of Catherine II and her son Paul's tutor, was made England's provincial Grand Master, a position he held until 1784. Yelagin was married to a former lady-in-waiting of Empress Elizabeth and became a senator and chief secretary. The two Panin brothers, also influential at art courts and tutors of Paul, were members. Count Nikita Panin was a foreign affairs minister under Catherine. Yelagin had, incidentally, previously been arrested on charges trumpeted up by court rivals during the last years of Elizabeth's reign, but was exonerated. Nikolai Ivanovich Novikov, a man who was to become one of the most influential Russian Freemasons, joined Freemasonry in 1775. Novikov was a member of the regiment that had put Catherine on the throne and also a member of Catherine's legislative commission. His portrait hangs in the Tetyakov Gallery of Russian Art in Moscow. By 1776, the English lodges were united with the German Zinzendorf system under the overall direction of Duke Ferdinand of Brunswick, who was no favorite of Catherine's. In 1777, Gustavus III of Sweden visited Catherine and brought with him papers for the consecration of the Swedish system of strict observance, which purported to be a revival of the Templars under Prince Gagarin, a friend of Paul's. Under Novikov's leadership, lodges in Moscow broke away from the Swedish system, became the first ideological class movement of the Russian aristocracy, and opposed the agnostic ideas permeating into Russia from France. However, they later would come under the influence of a Transylvanian, Mr. Schwartz, whose real sympathies were with the Rosicrucians, whose leaders were attached to the court of the Crown Prince of Prussia. Masonic lodges in Moscow, perhaps without their knowledge, were then paying subscriptions to Prussian Rosicrucianism. There were about 60 lodges in Russia at this time. Novikov turned against the Rosicrucian occult movement and he proposed the formation of a purely Christian philanthropic order. With profits from his printing operations, borrowed funds, and donations from his lodges, Novikov set up grain stores during the 1787 famine and provided grain and seed corn to about 100 private and state-owned villages, and he established other enterprises which were aimed at benefiting the serfs as well as himself. However, Catherine became suspicious of the activities of the Freemasons and of these philanthropic works, believing they had some political motive. Thus, the Masonic movement in Russia was becoming internally disjointed and misdirected. Their internal dissension was playing into the hands of the Jesuits, the Catholic Church, and the Old Believers, all of whom Catherine had to placate, and it was sowing the seeds of its own destruction. Religion and Freemasonry. When Catherine permitted printing presses to operate in 1783, she intended it to be a measure to assist the cultural development of Russia, and in this regard it was very effective. However, the Holy Synod press, which had a monopoly, complained to Catherine about the large volume of religious works being produced by the secular press. In response, 1787, Catherine prohibited the printing of all religious works except by the authorized presses. In Moscow alone, 313 religious books had been published by secular presses. 166 of these were printed by Novikov, and many of them were Masonic works. Membership of Masonic lodges, both in Russia and abroad, enabled Russian noblemen to socialize with foreigners on various origins and to build networks. Already in the 18th century, numerous Russians, many of whom subsequently became eminent, are known to have belonged to visited lodges across Europe. For example, we find Prince Gavril Gagarin and Alexander Kurakin in lodges situated in Stockholm, one of the Vorontsovs in Warsaw, Mikhail Kutuzov, who would become commander-in-chief of the Russian army during Napoleon's invasion of Russia, in Ratisbon, the dramatist Vladimir Lukin and others in Berlin, Andrei Bolotov, the agriculturalist and writer, and Alexander Suvorov, the future generalissimo of Russia's ground and naval forces in Königsberg. Evidently, many 18th century Russian nobles also joined or visited lodges in France. To give only a few examples, we find Pyotr Dubrovsky, Prince Dmitry Golitsyn, and Stepan Kolyochov in lodges in Paris, Count Dmitry Guruvev and Nikolai Muravyov, Semyon Naryashkin and Gustav Stackelberg in Strasbourg, where various members of the Golitsyn family were also active. Some Russians became prominent in French Freemasonry, for example the Francophile Count Alexander Stroganov, a future president of the Russian Imperial Academy of Arts and director of the Imperial Library, represented a lodge based in Besançon, the perfect equality, la parfaite égalité, and all the lodges of the French Comté region of the founding meeting of the Grand Orient of France, Grand Orient de France, in 1773. He subsequently occupied leading positions in that organization. Stroganov was also one of the founders of the Lodge of United Friends, Les Amis Réunis, in Paris, and a member of another well-known Parisian lodge, the Nine Sisters, Les Neuf Sœurs, very important lodge, whose other members included Voltaire, the Count of Mirabeau, Benjamin Franklin, several prominent scientists and arts, Gilbert Rome, a future tutor to Stroganov's son Pavel, and a participant in and eventually victim of the French Revolution. Many Russians who had moved in Masonic circles abroad subsequently took part in the Masonic movement in their homeland. Here too they could socialize with foreigners, since most Russian lodges in the 18th and 19th century had numerous foreign members. Indeed, Freemasonry was a cosmopolitan movement and also a movement that was accessible to men of different faiths and from various social classes and backgrounds. All members of the society are brothers, we read in a text used by Russian Freemasons in the period in which Novikov was active, and neither languages, nor clothes, nor opinions, nor distinctions, nor fortune, nor wealth make for the slightest distinction among them. Language use in the Russian Masonic lodges. For example, participating in or communicating with Masonic lodges outside of Russia, French as the European lingua franca may have been the most frequently used language. Also, like the Russian oligarchy, aristocracy was very obsessed with France. It was the language, for example, in which Yelagin and Kurakin conducted or drafted correspondence with the Swedish Grand Lodge when in the late 1770s they were discussing the possibility of Russian Freemasons joining the Swedish system. It was also the language used in Swedish license authorizing the establishment of a directory in St. Petersburg in 1780. Thus, Francophonie was used as a tool for Russians when they practiced this form of sociability in a foreign setting or with foreign partners, no less than when they practiced other forms of sociability such as attendance at balls, salons, or visits to the theater and institutions of learning. That is not to deny, of course, that German was also a useful medium for Russian Freemasons who were living in or visiting German-speaking or Prussian countries, who wished to maintain links with Freemasons in those countries. Within Russian lodges, too, bilingualism and multilingualism were important assets for Russian Freemasons, sure, because you can talk in a language and your other brother don't understand you, right? It's wonderful. The left hand doesn't know what the right hand does, and vice versa. The increasing importance of Germans in Russian official and social circles in the 18th century, the presence of a German community inside Russia, the status of German lodges in the international Masonic movements, and the relative geographical proximity of the German world to Russia. Consider that Prussia, this is basically Poland, right? All these factors ensured that German was much used in Russia and in the Masonic social domain, as in other domains. In any case, not all Russian Masons had French or at least sufficient command of it. From an early age in the history of Russian Freemasonry, French too was a working language in which members of the Russian lodges or visitors to them might make speeches, write documents such as rules and regulations, charters, constitutions, and descriptions of rituals, make minutes of meeting, conduct correspondence, compile membership lists, and sing hymns. We know, for example, that as early as 1760, Baron de Tschudi, a prominent French Freemason who became secretary to the Francophile Ivan Shuvalov, a favorite of the Empress Elizabeth, made a speech in French at one of the St. Petersburg lodges. In the Alexandrine age, with which we are chiefly concerned here, French was the working language in the Lodge of United Friends, which had been founded in St. Petersburg in 1802. In accordance with the French system of Freemasonry and in the Palestine Lodge founded there in 1809. The latter lodge did not accept Russian as its second working language until 1813 under the pressure from its Russian members. Although the war against Napoleon had the effect of stimulating an increase in the number of translations of Masonic ceremonials into Russian, French continued to be much used in the lodges in these years immediately after the end of the wars. The Orpheus Lodge, founded in late 1818, for example, used French for speeches, rules, and books of ritual, and the Free Virtues Lodge produced minutes in French as well as in Russian. When in 1818 a Freemason from Berlin was instructed to collect information on Russian lodges, the answer to the question that had been formulated for him in German were provided in French. The Lodge of Alexander and the Triple Salvation and the languages used in it. Blah, blah, blah. Okay. Good. Next article. So now we are in the modern age. This is from thesquaremagazine.com. The article is from 2004. Modern Russian Freemasons are numerously few. The overall membership nowadays is very unlikely to rise above the 1,500 marks. Consider that America has at least 8 million Freemasons, although probably much more. However, these scarce troops are unevenly distributed among a dozen of obediences, which spring mainly from French sources and most of the time follow the ways and customs of the same, delving nonetheless from time to time into the vast and deep gulfs of Russian authentic singularity. Surely, this modern-day situation of Russian Freemasons might be viewed as a clear and defined result of treading the long and winding road of their history in this country. So in this article they say, despite the complexity of the intermasonic relations with her country, the great Tsarina, shocked and perplexed by the French Revolution and conspiracy theories therewith connected, decided to chop this guardian knot once and for all. She banned Freemasonry in the country and had some prominent Masons, including famous publisher, journalist, and esotericist Nicholas Novikov, jailed and exiled. Her son Paul I, ascending to the throne and revoking each and every of his mother's resolutions he could lay his hands on, acquitted Catherine's Masonic victims, but endorsed the ban of Masonic meetings, inducting some noble Masons into the Maltese knighthood instead, being the Grand Master of the Hospitallers at that time. The voluminous and exhaustive dictionary of Masonic biographies by the most prominent Russian Masonic historian Andrei Zerkov provides around 4,000 live records of lodge members of the period. Paul I is often called the Russian researchers by Russian Paul I is often called by Russian researchers the Russian Hamlet, presumably trying desperately to come up with the expectations of his dead father, assassinated by his mother's minions. However, the tumultuous 6 years of his reign resulted only in being assassinated by his son's tutors and friends, after which his son Alexander declared to the court nobility that under him everything shall be like under the granny. A year later, Alexander I issued an oral unofficial resolution permitting Masons to gather in lodges again, and thus the second period of Russian Freemasonry started 1802 and 1822, up to 1822. It was characterized briefly by the revival of old Templar systems of Swedish origin and the semi-secret operations of a very narrow Rosicrucian circle until the end of the Napoleonic War of 1812 and 1814, after which some liberal French Masonic ideas penetrated Russia along with the victorious troops returning home. In 1815, a new Grand Lodge Astrea was established in St. Petersburg that proclaimed rejection of all higher degrees and hierarchy, as well as the intention to work only free symbolic degrees and promote democracy as the core of its internal government. This time the prohibition lasted longer. The next 5 years were traditionally spent in intermasonic quarrels and mutual accusations of high treason and espionage, accurately transmitted by both parties to the gendarmerie headquarters. At the same time, many military Masons left their lodges to create quasi-Masonic and quasi-Carbonari orders and societies to promote the ideas of democratic rule and prepare plans of a political coup. As a result, being expressively tired of the concurring accusations and gossip, Emperor Alexander issued an official ban of all Masonic organizations in 1822. In 1825, Alexander I died, the revolutionary military attempted coup d'etat failed, and the putschists were sent to Siberia, while the next Tsar, Nicholas I, reasserted the ban of Freemasonry in 1826. So in this article they say, despite the complexity of the intermasonic relations with her country, the great Tsarina, shocked and perplexed by the French Revolution and conspiracy theories therewith connected, decided to chop this guardian knot once and for all. She banned Freemasonry in the country and had some prominent Masons, including famous publisher, journalist, and esotericist Nicholas Novikov, jailed and exiled. Her son Paul I, ascending to the throne and revoking each and every of his mother's resolutions he could lay his hands on, acquitted Catherine's Masonic victims, but endorsed the ban of Masonic meetings, inducting some noble Masons into the Maltese knighthood instead, being the Grand Master of the Hospitallers at that time. The voluminous and exhaustive dictionary of Masonic biographies by the most prominent Russian Masonic historian Andrei Zerkov provides around 4,000 live records of lodge members of the period. Paul I is often called the Russian researchers by Russian blah blah blah. Sorry. Paul I is often called by Russian researchers the Russian Hamlet, presumably trying desperately to come up with the expectations of his dead father, assassinated by his mother's minions. However, the tumultuous 6 years of his reign resulted only in being assassinated by his son's tutors and friends, after which his son Alexander declared to the court nobility that under him everything shall be like under the granny. A year later, Alexander I issued an oral unofficial resolution permitting Masons to gather in lodges again, and thus the second period of Russian Freemasonry started 1802 and 1822, up to 1822. It was characterized briefly by the revival of old Templar systems of Swedish origin and the semi-secret operations of a very narrow Rosicrucian circle until the end of the Napoleonic War of 1812 and 1814, after which some liberal French Masonic ideas penetrated Russia along with the victorious troops returning home. In 1815, a new Grand Lodge Astrea was established in St. Petersburg that proclaimed rejection of all higher degrees and hierarchy, as well as the intention to work only free symbolic degrees and promote democracy as the core of its internal government. This time the prohibition lasted longer. The next 5 years were traditionally spent in intermasonic quarrels and mutual accusations of high treason and espionage, accurately transmitted by both parties to the gendarmerie headquarters. At the same time, many military Masons left their lodges to create quasi-Masonic and quasi-Carbonari orders and societies to promote the ideas of democratic rule and prepare plans of a political coup. As a result, being expressively tired of the concurring accusations and gossip, Emperor Alexander issued an official ban of all Masonic organizations in 1822. In 1825, Alexander I died, the revolutionary military attempted coup d'etat failed, and the putschists were sent to Siberia, while the next Tsar, Nicholas I, reasserted the ban of Freemasonry in 1826. So I have here a text written by Vladislav Rejutski et al. This is February 2013. Foreign Languages and Noble Sociability, the documents from Russian Masonic lodges. In the Alexandrine Age, from 1801 to 25, Freemasonry underwent a strong revival. It was in this period, in the winter of 1806 to 1807, to be precise, that Bezhukov attended his Masonic initiation in War and Peace. Despite the resistance of some conservative nationalists, such as Fyodor Rostopchin, who harbored a suspicion of Freemasons as carriers of seditious alien ideas, the authorities formally permitted lodges to operate from 1810. Numerous lodges sprang up or were invigorated during Alexander's reign, for example the Lodge of United Friends, the Palestine Lodge, the Free Virtues, the Elizabeth and the Virtue, the Alexander and Beneficence, and 2 Grand Lodges into which the Russian directional body split in 1814, namely the Grand Provincial Lodge and the Grand Lodge of Astrea. Among the men who frequented these lodges were many aristocrats, such as the Princess Ilya Dolgorukov, I'm sorry, I'm butchering these names again, Sergei Trubotskoy, and Sergei Volkonsky, and men who were to become major literati, such as Pyotr Chadev, author of the so-called philosophical letters, and Alexander Gribodeov, author of the powerful satirical play Woe from the Wit. Despite the prevailing reactionary climate in Russia in the post-Napoleonic period, Alexander I continued to tolerate this Masonic activity until 1822, when finally an edict was passed banning all the lodges and secret societies in general. Nicholas I reiterated the prohibition of 1826 following the Decembrist revolt. The mutiny of governance was aware a Masonic lodge was capable of developing either into a politically benign force which encouraged self-improvement and philanthropy, or into a seedbed for revolutionary ideas. On the one hand, lodges fostered the belief in the possibility of self-perfection and insisted in a high standard of personal conduct. Masons also performed charitable deeds, visiting prisons, promoting education and aiding the poor.
The Tsar Alexander I of Russia played a significant role in the defeat of Napoleon Bonaparte during
Membership of Masonic lodges, both in Russia and abroad, enabled Russian noblemen to socialize with foreigners on various origins and to build networks. Already in the 18th century, numerous Russians, many of whom subsequently became eminent, are known to have belonged to visited lodges across Europe. For example, we find Prince Gavril Gagarin and Alexander Kurakin in lodges situated in Stockholm, one of the Vorontsovs in Warsaw, Mikhail Kutuzov, who would become commander-in-chief of the Russian army during Napoleon's invasion of Russia, in Ratisbon, the dramatist Vladimir Lukin and others in Berlin, Andrei Bolotov, the agriculturalist and writer, and Alexander Suvorov, the future generalissimo of Russia's ground and naval forces in Königsberg. Evidently, many 18th century Russian nobles also joined or visited lodges in France. To give only a few examples, we find Pyotr Dubrovsky, Prince Dmitry Golitsyn, and Stepan Kolyochov in lodges in Paris, Count Dmitry Guruvev and Nikolai Muravyov, Semyon Naryashkin and Gustav Stackelberg in Strasbourg, where various members of the Golitsyn family were also active. Some Russians became prominent in French Freemasonry, for example the Francophile Count Alexander Stroganov, a future president of the Russian Imperial Academy of Arts and director of the Imperial Library, represented a lodge based in Besançon, the Perfect Equality, La Parfaite Égalité, and all the lodges of the French Comté region of the founding meeting of the Grand Orient of France, Grand Orient de France, in 1773. He subsequently occupied leading positions in that organization. Stroganov was also one of the founders of the Lodge of United Friends, Les Amis Réunis, in Paris, and a member of another well-known Parisian lodge, the Nine Sisters, Les Neuf Sœurs, very important lodge, whose other members included Voltaire, the Count of Mirabeau, Benjamin Franklin, several prominent scientists and arts, Gilbert Rome, a future tutor to Stroganov's son Pavel, and a participant in and eventually victim of the French Revolution. Many Russians who had moved in Masonic circles abroad subsequently took part in the Masonic movement in their homeland. Here too they could socialize with foreigners, since most Russian lodges in the 18th and 19th century had numerous foreign members. Indeed, Freemasonry was a cosmopolitan movement and also a movement that was accessible to men of different faiths and from various social classes and backgrounds. All members of the society are brothers, we read in a text used by Russian Freemasons in the period in which Novikov was active, and neither languages, nor clothes, nor opinions, nor distinctions, nor fortune, nor wealth make for the slightest distinction among them. Language use in the Russian Masonic lodges. For example, participating in or communicating with Masonic lodges outside of Russia French, as the European lingua franca, may have been the most frequently used language. Also, like the Russian oligarchy, aristocracy was very obsessed with France. It was the language, for example, in which Yelagin and Kurakin conducted or drafted correspondence with the Swedish Grand Lodge when in the late 1770s they were discussing the possibility of Russian Freemasons joining the Swedish system. It was also the language used in Swedish license authorizing the establishment of a directory in St. Petersburg in 1780. Thus, Francophonie was used as a tool for Russians when they practiced this form of sociability in a foreign setting or with foreign partners, no less than when they practiced other forms of sociability such as attendance at balls, salons, or visits to the theater and institutions of learning. That is not to deny, of course, that German was also a useful medium for Russian Freemasons who were living in or visiting German-speaking or Prussian countries, who wished to maintain links with Freemasons in those countries. Within Russian lodges, too, bilingualism and multilingualism were important assets for Russian Freemasons, sure, because you can talk in a language and your other brother don't understand you, right? It's wonderful. The left hand doesn't know what the right hand does, and vice versa. The increasing importance of Germans in Russian official and social circles in the 18th century, the presence of a German community inside Russia, the status of German lodges in the international Masonic movements, and the relative geographical proximity of the German world to Russia. Consider that Prussia, this is basically Poland, right? All these factors ensured that German was much used in Russia and in the Masonic social domain, as in other domains. In any case, not all Russian Masons had French, or at least sufficient command of it. From an early age in the history of Russian Freemasonry, French too was a working language in which members of the Russian lodges or visitors to them might make speeches, write documents such as rules and regulations, charters, constitutions, and descriptions of rituals, make minutes of meeting, conduct correspondence, compile membership lists, and sing hymns. We know, for example, that as early as 1760, Baron de Tschudi, a prominent French Freemason who became secretary to the Francophile Ivan Shuvalov, a favorite of the Empress Elizabeth, made a speech in French at one of the St. Petersburg lodges. In the Alexandrine age, with which we are chiefly concerned here, French was the working language in the Lodge of United Friends, which had been founded in St. Petersburg in 1802. In accordance with the French system of Freemasonry and in the Palestine Lodge founded there in 1809. The latter lodge did not accept Russian as its second working language until 1813 under the pressure from its Russian members. Although the war against Napoleon had the effect of stimulating an increase in the number of translations of Masonic ceremonials into Russian, French continued to be much used in the lodges in these years immediately after the end of the wars. The Orpheus Lodge, founded in late 1818, for example, used French for speeches, rules, and books of ritual, and the Free Virtues Lodge produced minutes in French as well as in Russian. When in 1818 a Freemason from Berlin was instructed to collect information on Russian lodges, the answer to the question that had been formulated for him in German were provided in French. The Lodge of Alexander and the Triple Salvation and the languages used in it. Blah, blah, blah. Okay. Good. Next article. So now we are in the modern age. This is from thesquaremagazine.com. The article is from 2004. Modern Russian Freemasons are numerously few. The overall membership nowadays is very unlikely to rise above the 1,500 marks. Consider that America has at least 8 million Freemasons, although probably much more. However, these scarce troops are unevenly distributed among a dozen of obediences, which spring mainly from French sources and most of the time follow the ways and customs of the same, delving nonetheless from time to time into the vast and deep gulfs of Russian authentic singularity. Surely, this modern-day situation of Russian Freemasons might be viewed as a clear and defined result of treading the long and winding road of their history in this country. In the Alexandrine Age, from 1801 to 25, Freemasonry underwent a strong revival. It was in this period, in the winter of 1806 to 1807, to be precise, that Beshukov attended his Masonic initiation in War and Peace. Despite the resistance of some conservative nationalists, such as Fyodor Rostopchin, who harbored a suspicion of Freemasons as carriers of seditious alien ideas, the authorities formally permitted lodges to operate from 1810. Numerous lodges sprang up or were invigorated during Alexander's reign, for example the Lodge of United Friends, the Palestine Lodge, the Free Virtues, the Elizabeth and the Virtue, the Alexander and Beneficence, and two Grand Lodges into which the Russian directional body split in 1814, namely the Grand Provincial Lodge and the Grand Lodge of Austria. Among the men who frequented these lodges were many aristocrats, such as the Princess Ilya Dolgorukov, I'm sorry, I'm butchering these names again, Sergei Trubotskoy and Sergei Volkonsky, and men who were to become major literati, such as Pyotr Chadev, author of the so-called philosophical letters, and Alexander Gribodeov, author of the powerful satirical play Woe from the Wit.
Masonic Short Talks, Alexander I. Alexander I succeeded Paul I as Emperor of Russia in 1801. He then renewed the prohibitions against all secret societies, especially Freemasons. 2 years later, Bober, counselor of the state and director of the military school at St. Petersburg, had an audience with the emperor. Bober described the object of the institution and doctrine of its mysteries in such a way that the emperor rescinded the decrees. The emperor gave the institution protection and asked to be initiated into the order, which was done. The Grand Lodge Astraea of Russia was established, and Bober was elected Grand Master.
So this article is by en.topvar.ru, August 13, 2012. On 13th August of 1822, the sovereign Alexander I signed the rescript on the prohibition of secret societies and Masonic lodges. On August 13th, 1822, Alexander Alexis III signed the prescript on the prohibition of secret societies and Masonic lodges. Masonic lodges emerged in Russia in the first half of the 18th century. They were banned under Catherine II and Paul I, but they continued their activities. Alexander's government initially allowed the activities of Freemasonry in Russia, trying to control them and even use them for their own purposes. However, Alexander soon realized that the goals of Freemasonry were radically at odds with his own national interests. Conspiratorial lodges of the highest degrees began to emerge in the Russian Empire, and Freemasonry itself turned out to be closely linked to the activities of subversive structures, including the Decembrists. The activities of the Freemasons were harmful to the state and orthodoxy. Therefore, Emperor Alexander tried to suppress the activities of secret structures in the empire. The official date of the appearance of Masonic lodges is considered to be in the middle of the 17th century, although some researchers believe that secret organizations began to develop in the territory of Russia as early as the 1731. Peter I and his associates Franz Lefort and Patrick Gordon are named among the founders of Freemasonry in the Russian state. In 1750, the Grand Master of the Great London Lodge, Lord Lovell, appointed Captain John Phillips as the provincial Grand Master for the Russian state. So more on Alexander. During the reign of Emperor Alexander, the activities of Moscow lodges was restored. The Grand Lodge Astrea was found in St. Petersburg. I think it is a Scottish Rite Lodge. It was created according to the English model, following the example of the Grand Lodge of England. Count Musin Pushkin became its Grand Master. Among the Masons were many future Decembrists, including the leader of the Southern Society of Decembrists, Pavel Pestel. By the time of its closure in 1822, the Grand Lodge of Astrea had 19 lodges, and its competitor, the Grand Provincial Lodge, had 7 lodges. The essence of Freemasonry in Russia is well illustrated by the uprising of December 1825. Masons predominated among the leaders of the Decembrist rebels. Contrary to the opinion imposed on Soviet and Russian residents, This is bullshit. Contrary to the opinion imposed on Russian residents about the Decembrists as knights without fear and reproach, they were real enemies of the people. They planned not only to turn Russia into a weak, decentralized state, a constitutional monarchy or republic, but also to dismember it into a federation or confederation of several independent, isolated territories. The royal dynasty was to be destroyed. In the event of a victory by the Decembrists, Russia would be turned into easy prey for the Western colonial empires. Later, the activities of Freemasonry went underground, moving into the cultural sphere. Only during the reign of Tsar Nicholas II were their activities legalized in the 20th century.
So Alexander I lifted the ban on Freemasonry in 1803, and then in 18 support it. Lifted the ban on Freemasonry. He is rumored to have taken the degrees in 1803, but like Peter the Great, I think that's much more just fancy and a bit of historical editing out of convenience sake, as opposed to something that has its basis in reality. But we don't know either way, and we're never going to know either way. So Alexander I lifted the ban on Freemasonry in 1803, and then in 1810 he actually specifically put out legislation that formally allowed the reestablishment of lodges in Russia. And I wish I could say everything was hunky-dory at this point, but it wasn't, because at this point in time we had an era between 1810 and 1822 of competing Grand Lodges. We had the Directorial Lodge, which traced its authority back to Yelagin in St. Petersburg. Again, that 3-degree English speculative masonry feel. And then you had the United Lodges of Alexander, Yelizaveta, and Peter, which was a contradictory style of masonry. In 1815, Directorial Lodge disbanded and formed 2 Grand Lodges out of that, which were the Grand Directorial Lodge and the Grand Lodge of Astrea.
So more on Alexander. During the reign of Emperor Alexander, the activities of Moscow lodges was restored. The Grand Lodge Astrea was found in St. Petersburg. I think it is a Scottish Rite Lodge. It was created according to the English model, following the example of the Grand Lodge of England. Count Musin Pushkin became its Grand Master. Among the Masons were many future Decembrists, including the leader of the Southern Society of Decembrists, Pavel Pestel. By the time of its closure in 1822, the Grand Lodge of Astrea had 19 lodges, and its competitor, the Grand Provincial Lodge, had 7 lodges. The essence of Freemasonry in Russia is well illustrated by the uprising of December 1825. Masons predominated among the leaders of the Decembrist rebels. Contrary to the opinion imposed on Soviet and Russian residents, despite the prevailing reactionary climate in Russia in the post-Napoleonic period, Alexander I continued to tolerate this Masonic activity until 1822, when finally an edict was passed banning all the lodges and secret societies in general. Nicholas I reiterated the prohibition of 1826 following the Decembrist revolt. The mutiny of governance was aware a Masonic lodge was capable of developing either into a politically benign force which encouraged self-improvement and philanthropy, or into a seedbed for revolutionary ideas. On the one hand, lodges fostered the belief in the possibility of self-perfection and insisted in a high standard of personal conduct. Masons also performed charitable deeds, visiting prisons, promoting education and aiding the poor. On the other hand, their social concern was bound eventually to lead to reflection on the causes of social problems and to consideration of all sorts of ways of removing political obstacles to the solution of these problems. Moreover, lodges elaborate their own problems. So they want their own problems. They want themselves to spread, not you, not me. Moreover, lodges elaborate rituals, ceremonies and degrees of initiation help members to develop habits that would also hold political conspirators in good stead. The function of Russian Masonic lodges as an effective preparatory school for prospective Republicans is surely demonstrated by the fact that a large number of those officers in 1825 would become Decembrists. For example, Nikita Muravyov, Sergei Muravyov, Apostol Pavel Pestel, and the poet Kondraty Rylev, and the above-mentioned Trubetskoy had been members of one or more of them in the post-Napoleonic period. So this article is by en.topvar.ru, August 13, 2012. On 13th August of 1822, the sovereign Alexander I signed the rescript on the prohibition of secret societies and Masonic lodges. On August 13th, 1822, Alexander Alexis III signed the prescript on the prohibition of secret societies and Masonic lodges. Masonic lodges emerged in Russia in the first half of the 18th century. They were banned under Catherine II and Paul I, but they continued their activities. Alexander's government initially allowed the activities of Freemasonry in Russia, trying to control them and even use them for their own purposes. However, Alexander soon realized that the goals of Freemasonry were radically at odds with his own national interests. Conspiratorial lodges of the highest degrees began to emerge in the Russian Empire, and Freemasonry itself turned out to be closely linked to the activities of subversive structures, including the Decembrists. The activities of the Freemasons were harmful to the state and orthodoxy. Therefore, Emperor Alexander tried to suppress the activities of secret structures in the empire.
Many Russian military officers already belonged to a secret society. Freemasonry had been imported from Europe in the 18th century and was popular among army officers. But in 1816, officers from Russia's prestigious Guards regiments, based in St. Petersburg, formed a new secret society, the Union of Salvation. 4 of its founding members would play a leading role in a revolutionary movement that became known as the Decembrists.
On the other hand, their social concern was bound eventually to lead to reflection on the causes of social problems and to consideration of all sorts of ways of removing political obstacles to the solution of these problems. Moreover, lodges elaborate their own problems. So they want their own problems. They want themselves to spread, not you, not me. Moreover, lodges elaborate rituals, ceremonies and degrees of initiation help members to develop habits that would also hold political conspirators in good stead. The function of Russian Masonic lodges as an effective preparatory school for prospective Republicans is surely demonstrated by the fact that a large number of those officers in 1825 would become Decembrists. For example, Nikita Muravyov, Sergei Muravyov, Apostol Pavel Pestel, and the poet Kondraty Rylev, and above mentioned Trubetskoy, had been members of one or more of them in the post-Napoleonic period.
They will then use these troops to seize control of the capital, the emperor, and the government. They will form 3 groups. The first will be led by Captain Alexander Yakubovich, a distinguished veteran of the Caucasus War with a reputation for courage. His men will seize the Winter Palace and secure. He will require an oath of loyalty that morning from all officials and troops in St. Petersburg. The Decembrists know that if the troops swear that oath, their cause is lost. There might not be another opportunity like this in decades. The 14th of December becomes do or die for the revolutionaries. And before the day is out, the streets of the Russian capital will run with blood. 14th December 1825, St. Petersburg. The Decembrists' Northern Society has its headquarters at the offices of the Russian-American Company, where one of its key members, Rylev, is a major shareholder. Decembrist leaders have been working feverishly day and night to put everything in place for a coup. Rylev is the chief organizer, despite being unwell. Before dawn, they learn that the new emperor has ordered all troops and officials in the capital to swear an oath of loyalty to him that morning. July 1826. Nicholas commutes the sentence to hanging. But the execution of the 5 Decembrists by the ramparts of the Peter and Paul fortress is badly botched. As the men are hanged, ropes break, and 3 men fall to the ground. What a miserable country. They can't even hang us properly, remarks one survivor. Spectators appeal for mercy. According to tradition, a man who survives a hanging should be spared. Instead, more rope is found, and the second time, there is no mistake. More than 80 Decembrists were eventually sent to Siberia.
So you had Священная Дружина for the good guys. It means something like sacred host. It was a secret monarchist society formed after the assassination of Tsar Alexander II. And then you had all the liberals who did the February Revolution. They were all members of the Grand Orient of Russia's peoples. This was an illegal Masonic organization. It was legal for some years, but it existed before in the underground and afterwards in the underground. All important people in the legal parliamentary opposition were members of the Grand Orient. And all the top brass of the Constitutional Democrat Party, like Nabokov's, the author of Nabokov's Father and Uncle, for example. By the way, Nabokov's father, he was deeply involved in the February Revolution. He even was the author of the abdication document from Mikhail, the Grand Duke Mikhail, who officially took the throne after Nicholas' alleged abdication. And he actually wanted to put his memoirs into the Archive of the Russian Revolution, which was a project that was started in the early 20s by liberal white emigres in Germany and France. And he announced this in early 1922, that he would put his uncensored memoirs in there. And well, 2 months later he was murdered. during an assassination attempt on Pavel Milukov, another leader of the February revolutionaries, who was, as far as I have heard, pretty much the only person in that gang who was not a Freemason, or at least not an important Freemason. And supposedly this assassination was organized by right-wing Russian officers who wanted to take revenge on him because of his involvement in the revolution. But Milukov got away, and only Nabokov Sr. died that day. The whole affair was extremely shady, and some people think that the assassination was arranged by his former comrades from the Constitutional Democrat movement to stop him from revealing too much about the February coup in his memoirs. The version that was eventually published after his death and included in the archive of the Russian Revolution was heavily abridged and edited, and of course not by Nabokov himself. Then you had the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks were organized in the Rite of Memphis Mizraim. This is just another rite, another Masonic rite. You know, the Grand Masonic organizations, they have these rites, which is kind of like a constitution of this Masonic movement, and the Grand Orient was French and Memphis Mizraim was Scottish, or the other way around, doesn't really matter. But Memphis Mizraim were very much engaged in LARPing as Egyptians, and you know what René Guénon said about Egyptian magic, that from the whole corpus of Egyptian esoteric tradition, only the magic, the black magic survived.
I samband med Rysslands nederlag i kriget med Japan 1904-1905 satte det internationella kapitalet igång en revolution i Sankt Petersburg. Huvudorganisatorn Alexander Parvus fick 2 miljoner pund från Japan för att organisera maktövertagandet i Ryssland. Man satsade totalt 50 miljoner dollar på revolutionen i Ryssland år 1905. Japan försåg revolutionärerna med vapen. Den revolutionära verksamheten samordnades av överste Motojiro Akashi, före detta militärattaché i Ryssland. För planeringen stod frimurarna. Den amerikanske bankiren och frimuraren Jacob Schiff såg till att inga banker fick låna pengar till Ryssland under kriget. Samtidigt stödde han revolutionära grupper i Ryssland. Det internationella kapitalet ville i Ryssland överta makten i arbetarnas namn. Bakom dessa aktioner låg bland andra hemliga sällskap B'nai Brit, vars högkvarter är beläget i Washington DC. År 1905 fick terrorn en oanad omfattning. Fanatikerna började mörda urskillningslöst. Åren 1905 till 1906 dödades eller lemlästades 50 000 personer. I april 1906 utnämnde tsar Nikolaus II Piotr Stolypin till inrikesminister och snart därefter även till premiärminister. Stolypin fick med tiden slut på terrorn och revolutionen. Han hade inte någon annan utväg än att införa ståndrätter för att skrämma och bekämpa terroristerna. 35 000 revolutionärer flydde utomlands, först och främst till USA, som blev terroristernas fristad. Från och med juni 1907 hade Stolypin läget under kontroll. Landet började tillfriskna efter Parvus och Trotskijs illdåd. Den 26 augusti 1906 utsatte frimurarradikalerna Stolypins hem för ett sprängattentat. Offren var besökare och militärer. 27 dödades, 40 skadades, däribland premiärministerns son. Hans dotter kastades av tryckvågen ut ur huset och blev halt för livet.
Under Nicholas II, the last Tsar of Russia, Freemasonry was eventually legalized and enjoyed a brief revival only after the First Revolution of 1905 and the October Manifesto of 1905 that granted limited rights to unions and private meetings. This period saw the birth of the Grand Orient of Russia's Peoples, GOORP, an illegal co-Freemasonry political organization that existed in Russia from 1912 till 1917, built with the help of the French Illuminati that succeeded, however, from the Grand Orient de France, with Nikolai Vissarionovich Nekrasov and Alexander Fyodorovich Kerensky as its main leaders, as well as Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, better known as Lenin, founder of the Russian Communist Party or Bolsheviks, inspirer of the Bolshevik Revolution, that he put in motion after conveniently closing all the lodges in 1917. Lenin was also a member of the French Masonic lodge L'Union de Belleville in Paris, a communist lodge that was used by the Illuminati to recruit influential political figures like Lenin and supported in the past the Paris Commune, a revolutionary government that seized power in Paris, the capital of France, from 18 March to 28 of May of 1871. Debates over the policies and outcome of the Commune had also significant influence on the ideas of both Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, who described it as the first example of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Lenin and the Grand Orient of Russia's Peoples inspired Russian brothers to try and take high places in state bodies and diplomatic military circles. They had their people in the French embassy, French embankment, St. Petersburg, State Council, Progressist Bloc of the State Duma, Cadet, Oktyabrist, Trudovik parties and factions, working groups of Military Industrial Council, General Staff after 1915, Moscow State Duma, Commerce and Industry Alliance, the University of St. Petersburg and Moscow respectively.
Ur 33 gradens hemliga invigning kan man läsa:
Frimureriet är ingenting mer och ingenting mindre än revolutionen i verksamhet, den oavbrutet fortgående sammansvärjningen.
Därför är det inte underligt att Leiba Bronstein redan år 1898 hade börjat på allvar studera frimureriet och de hemliga samfundens historia, medan han under nästan 2 år satt fängslad i Odessa för omstörtande verksamhet. Han gjorde 1000 sidor anteckningar. Till bolsjevismen kom Trotskij genom sitt studium av frimureriet, uppger Internationales Freimaurerlexikon. Trotskij själv skrev i sina memoarer Mitt liv.
Det var under denna period som jag blev intresserad av frimurarna. Under flera månader studerade jag ivrigt böcker om deras historia. Böcker som jag fick av släktingar och vänner i staden. Varför hade köpmän, konstnärer, bankirer, ämbetsmän och advokater sedan början av 1600-talet börjat kalla sig frimurare och försökt återskapa de medeltida gillenas riter? Vad handlade denna märkliga maskerad om? Gradvis klarnade bilden. Bland vissa delar av frimurarna fanns det tydliga element av reaktionär feudalism.
Freemasons were especially active in the 4th State Duma, where they formed the Progressist Bloc in the summer of 1915 and tried to form the bloc comprising all opposition parties to eliminate the monarchy in Russia, following the original plan of the Illuminati.
Åren 1900 till 1902 hade han låtit i USA utbilda 10 000 revolutionärer från Ryssland. Deras uppgift var att krossa Tsarryssland. Han hjälpte till att finansiera den misslyckade statskuppen år 1905. Som fattig frimurarbroder började Trotskij genast tigga om resurser till sitt förstörelseuppdrag i Ryssland.
Trotskij bodde på det luxuösa hotell Astor vid Times Square.
Sedan betalade Jacob Schiff för hans lyxbostad på Vice Avenue nummer 1522 i stadsdelen Bronx 3 månader i förskott. Trotskij själv medgav i sina memoarer att hans arbetarbostad hade elektriskt ljus, gasspis, badrum, telefon, automatisk hiss och till och med ett sopnedkast.
The history of 20th century Russian Freemasonry begins in France, Paris, when several lodges working the Scottish Rite began to accept Russian immigrants in the 1890s. The first Russians to join these Freemasons was a philosopher, Virubov. He was followed by the inventor of the electric incandescent bulb, Yablokov, and a sociologist, Kovalevsky. Kovalevsky has been considered a founding father of Russian Freemasonry. Sorry, I'm butchering these Russian names. The latter was a member of the Parisian lodge Les Vrais Amis Fidèles, the true friends. Together with Yablokov in 1887, they formed Cosmos Lodge number 288 in Paris, which included both Russians and French people. Later it was closed and then revived in 1898. Kovalevsky's L'École des Hautes Études of the high schools was opened on November 14 in 1901. The Tsarist government were concerned that the school's activities were interfering with the remittance of money from Kovalev's banking account in Russia. The Russian government made Trochevsky and Anikov return home, or else they would have been deprived of Russian citizenship. Roberti de Castro was influenced in the same way, and as a result he left the school and terminated cooperation with Kovalevsky. After that he was registered as a Russian citizen again. Under the aegis of Cosmos Lodge, l'École Russe des Hautes Études, or the Higher Educational Center, assisted Russian immigrants in Paris from 1901 to 1904. This is all very interesting stuff. The first Scottish Rite Lodge, Cosmos, failed to become the center of gathering Russian Freemasons because of a concatenation of circumstances. In the late 1880s, Yablokov was absorbed in the preparation of the Russian exposition at the International Exhibition in France, Paris. Kotlerovsky was very ill, so Kovalevsky was invited to Stockholm, Sweden, to lecture in a local university. Russian professors and Masons such as M.M. Kovalevsky and many others conducted classes with non-Masons or alleged Masons, such as Plekhanov, founder of the first communist organization in Russia and teacher of Vladimir Lenin, later social democrat, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, Mekhnikov, world famous microbiologist who worked in the Pasteur Institute in Paris. Among the pupils were a future Minister of Education for the Bolshevik government, Lunacharsky. At the time he was member of a French lodge, and the Russian poet Voloshin. The annual school fees were 30 old French francs. The school assets were donated from the capital acquired by Kovalevsky after selling his lands in the Kharkov region. In 1903, the school comprised 400 pupils. So, among other participants were also the author Amfiteatrov. Later in Russia he became worshipful master of one of the Masonic lodges. The lawyer Maklakov, a member of the regular French Rite Lodge, L'Avant-Garde Masonique since May 8, 1905, and Russian ambassador to France in 1917. the dramatist Vasily Ivanovich Nemirovich Danchenko, the lawyer Kedrin, member of the regular French Right Lodge Les Innovateurs since June 15th, 1905. Initiation of Russians in the regular French Right Lodge only began in the spring of 1905. Since then they have usually preferred Scottish Rite Masonry. At the same time in Paris there was formed another Russian lodge, Mount Sinai, working the Scottish Rite. Among the initiated brothers, according to records of Kovalevsky, one can see Voloshin in April 1905, also initiated on March the 23rd in 1905 in the lodge Travail et Vrai Ami Fidèle. Kotlyarevsky, who received all 3 degrees on May 8 in 1905, and Nemirovich Danchenko. Until 1906 there were no Masonic lodges in Russia, although there were lodges in Poland and Lithuania. Despite this, in 1905, shortly before the revolution, during the Russian-Japanese War, Tsar Nikolai II received an anonymous letter which contained anti-Masonic accusations directed at Duke Obolensky and Count Vorontsov-Dashkov, the Lieutenant General of the Caucasus region, who later actually became a Freemason. On October 17, 1905, Tsar Nikolai II declared limited constitutional freedoms. In December 1906, Kovalevsky opened Polar Star Lodge in St. Petersburg with the assistance of Maklakov of the Constitutional Democrats or Cadets Party. It was the first permanent Freemasons lodge in Russia, the first Cadets Lodge, and the first lodge under the jurisdiction of the Grand Orient of France in Russia. Its founding members were such Russian intellectuals as Professors Gambarov, Ivanonyukov, Borodin, Pavlov, Silvansky, the physician Tsikharev, Baron Maidel, Margui, Chegolev, Nemirovich, Danchenko, and so on. On November 15, 1906, Duke Urusov, Deputy Minister of Internal Affairs and Deputy of the First State Duma, organized Resurrection Lodge in Moscow under the Grand Orient of France. The membership included notables such as Kovalevsky, Maklakov, Basenov, Anishkov, Nemirovich, Danchenko. It's always the same people. Spreading everywhere. And so on, Nekrasov and Baschenov. Also in 1906, Baschenov created Astrea Lodge in Moscow, working the rectified Scottish Rite. In 1908, Kovalevsky, Gambarov, Anichkov, Roberti, La Sera left the Polar Star Lodge to found yet a third Cosmos Lodge, working the ancient accepted Scottish Rite. From that point, Kovalevsky's influence among Freemasons sharply declined.
Söndagen den 13 januari 1917 anlände det spanska passagerarfartyget Montserrat till Ellis Island i New York. Ombord befann sig den internationella revolutionären Leiva Bronstein, ökänd under namnet Lev Trotsky. Han hade hela sin familj med sig. Trotsky hade börjat sin resa i Barcelona i Spanien den 25 december 1916. Han åkte i första klass, inte i tredje som han antyder i sina memoarer. Trotskys resehandlingar finns bevarade i Migrationsverkets arkiv och talar sitt tydliga språk. I andra arkiv finns bevarad en inbjudan till Amerika, vilken kan spåras till hans frimurarbroder Jacob Schiff, rysshatare och ordförande för bankhuset Kuhn, Loeb & Company på Wall Street i New York. Det var Jacob Schiff som redan år 1890 hade börjat anordna och finansiera kurser för internationella revolutionärer från Ryssland. Bnai Brit, förbundets söner, planlade undervisningen vid dessa kurser. Samma orden spelade en aktiv roll i den så kallade revolutionen år 1905.
It is often claimed that there were no Masons among the Bolsheviks, which is of course absurd. The Russian Social Democratic Party did not consist of Bolsheviks and Mensheviks. This is just a stupid thing where historians try to describe something analogous to, religious history like Catholics and Protestants. There were dozens of factions and they were uniting, separating, fighting against each other. And Lenin, of course, wasn't a Bolshevik. He left the Bolsheviks and more or less when joined the Menshevik position, and the Bolsheviks hated him. The Leninists and the Bolsheviks, these are completely different things. Trotsky, for example, for the longest time was the antagonist, the primary antagonist of Lenin, and then became his right hand. In immigration, in revolutionary immigration, these people, they lived next to each other, they became friends and then fought again and then became friends again. They shared their women, they had some kind of commune lifestyle, like, just a regular bohemian underground.
Trotsky höll också föredrag för emigranter från Ryssland och föreläste på East Villages Russian Free University på Östra 7:e gatan. I januari 1917 fick Trotsky kontakt med frimurarorden Bnai Brit, som redan tidigare hjälpt revolutionärer i Ryssland. Den som ombesörjde kontakterna mellan den revolutionära rörelsen i Ryssland och Bnai Brit var Jacob Schiff. Leiba Bronstein hade tidigare blivit medlem i den franska frimurarlogen Art et Travail, som även Lenin tillhörde. Frimuraren Winston Churchill bekräftade år 1920 att Trotsky även var illuminat.
A total of 5 lodges working the Scottish Rite existed in Russia before 1917, including Moscow's so-called Scottish Shop and the English lodges in St. Petersburg under worshipful masters Stanovich and Arkhangelsk. Later in 1911, the first convention declared Kovalevsky's Cosmos Lodge a part of the Grand Orient of Russia's people. Then in 1912, the second convention also required English lodges to join. James Percy published in the Right Moscow newspaper Veshe, November 1908, unrealistic information about a special role that British Freemasons allegedly played in the propagation of Masonic ideas in Russia. The author reported that they were planning to change the monarchist government with a liberal one. This provocation enabled the police to search the apartment of the worshipful master of the English lodge, Kistyakov, and forbid activities of the lodge. The search coincided with the planned meeting of the lodge, and all those present were registered as Freemasons in police files. The 2 French Rite lodges at that time comprised about 40 persons in total, mainly cadets, while the rest were Trudoviks or laborists and independent figures like lawyers Balavinsky, Goldovsky, Marguerite, Baron G. Meidel, librarian Braudo, historians Pavlov, Silvansky, and Shkegelov. The Supreme Council of the Grand Orient of France in Russia consisted of delegates from all the lodges, and its chairman, Margui, was elected. These lodges were then brought under the Grand Orient of France in Russia. It's one big bureaucracy. From 1907 to 1909, Russian Freemasons didn't object to being under the French jurisdiction. This shortly changed, and after a short struggle for power within the over-politicized Russian Masonic leadership, the lodges formally became independent from the Grand Orient of France in 1910. Before doing this, they had reluctantly deceived the general public, and some Freemasons having declared their intention to voluntarily close the lodges. This step was aimed at carrying out a political restructuring and electing a new leadership of Russian Freemasons. The idea of introducing these hidden reforms was to safeguard the security of the political wing of the Masonic movement in Russia. So why are the Masons always saying they are not political? They are installed for political reasons. Masonic lodges are installed to do certain political stuff, like for example the Propagandadue. So the idea of introducing these hidden reforms was to safeguard the security of the political wing of the Masonic movement in Russia by making it more secret and more flexible, silently influential and militant. It was not considered a violation of the Masonic rules. I hint here again, this is written by the Freemasons themselves. This is not some anti-Mason like me. It was not considered a violation of the Masonic rules because the Russian brothers just implemented the prerogatives once granted them by the Grand Orient of France, emissary Georges Boulet and Bertrand Sichol. They were given the right to found new lodges without preliminary consultations with and approval of the regular or seemingly regular French Rite Masonry. The real political situation dictated the necessity of arranging an organization able to control the masses after the revolution. This is on freemasonry.bcy.ca/text/go_russia.html. It's very interesting. I'm gonna read this again. The real political situation dictated the necessity of arranging an organization able to control the masses after the revolution. The new body was considered to be irregular, since there were no Masonic similarities with only 2 degrees, apprentice and master, except the requirements of secrecy and discipline and an obligation of secrecy. Like the Grand Orient of France, they had initiated women since 1774. They had also initiated women. For example, Kuskovka was a Freemason of the higher degrees. Other initiated women were Countess Sofia Panina, Poetess Zinaida Gipius, Peshkova, and Sokolovskaya. Saint Martin and Paskalski's Rosicrucianism, the Swedenborgian Rite, and the Rite of Philaletes would all have played a role in these people's concept of Freemasonry. Despite their irregularity, these Russian Freemasons kept fidelity to the Grand Orient of France. Emissaries of the Grand Orient of Russia inspired Russian brothers to try and take high places in state bodies and diplomatic and military circles. They had their people in the French embassy, State Council, the progressist bloc of Duma, so we have read this before. This was just paraphrased by Zagani.
Även i andra städer öppnades fängelseportarna på vid gavel. Fullständig anarki rådde. Brottslingar plundrade förråd, butiker och järnvägsvagnar. Folk mördades och rånades. Alexander Kerensky var det ryska frimureriets högsta råds sekreterare och ledare för Grand Orient i Ryssland.
Что все они были членами, почти все были членами масонской ложи, тоже бесспорно. Значит, если можно назвать это масонским заговором.
L'Entente was interested in Russia as a true ally of France in the war with Germany. In this connection, some historians suspect the Grand Orients of France being a puppeteer that inspired Russian brothers to form a Supreme Council of Russia's people and allowing them to simplify Masonic ceremonies and rituals to improve political efficiency of Russian Masonry at the rank and file level. The leading Russian Masonic lodge, Polar Star, took an oath of fealty to the Grand Orient of France and its Supreme Council. A copy of this obligation is photocopied in People and Lodges by Nina Berberova. Lodges under the Grand Orient of France formed and worked under the supervision of the Grand Orient of France and its Supreme Council, initially including some members of the left-wing factions and party groups, Mensheviks or Social Democrats, Socialist Revolutionaries and the left wing of the Cadet Party. There had been no revolutionaries in the Masonic lodges so far. Nina Berberova contends that the earlier socialists joined the lodges after being disappointed in socialist ideals. Duke Kropotkin, father of the Russian anarchist movement, mixed illusion with reality, saying that the Russian revolutionary movement found it good and useful to be linked with the Masons. In reality, Masonry before 1910 only united the liberal and conservative members. As later recognition by Deputy of the First State Duma Maklakov, all were against revolution. This soon changed as the leadership of the Masonic movement was usurped by left-wing Constitutional Democrat Cadet Party by Nekrasov, later a minister of the provisional government. The Grand Orient of France in Russia, or as some researchers call it, the Russian affiliate of the Grand Orient of France, was replaced by the Grand Orient of Russia's people. Since then, the history of the Russian Revolution, as written by Ivanovov in his From Peter Till Present Days, Russian Intelligentsia and Masonry, Karbin 1938, is a history of the progressive, liberal and radical socialist intelligentsia.
So to the district committee of the Communist Party, there came a delegation of old communists, people who still had fond memories of Stalin and so on. And they came there and they were asking, is it true that Lenin was a mushroom? And people were like, what? And so it's very strange. As I said, many people actually believe this, that Lenin turned into a mushroom because he consumed so many hallucinogenic mushrooms. It's kind of strange, but yeah, this is what people were ready to believe at that time. But that's of course just a fake story. There were many more interesting real stories. Enough of Lenin, we should talk about Stalin as well. Stalin and the occult. So I don't believe that Stalin was a Freemason, although he respected them. In the 20s, Stalin was something like the warden of Freemasons in Russia, Vertuchai. Vertuchai is a derogatory word, it's what felons call the prison guards. So Stalin was the Vertuchai of Freemasonry. I don't believe he was ever properly initiated himself, but he stood behind them with a gun. But he respected them, and I think he admired them a lot. His boss, Lenin, was a Freemason, of course. You have to understand that everything that happened in Russia between 1905 and 1917 was kind of a battle of Freemasons, There were good guy Masons and bad guy Masons, like in Twin Peaks, the television show by David Lynch. There is a white lodge and there is a black lodge. If I remember correctly, then Mark Frost, actually the co-producer was Lynch, he confirmed that he took the name of Black Lodge from the works of Madame Blavatsky. And in Madame Blavatsky's work, of course, Black Lodge just means a Masonic lodge that is engaging in black magic. Anyway, this isn't even anything crazy, You need secret societies to govern any large modern state because do you really believe in elections or things like this? This is absurd. So you need secret societies and that's just gonna happen if you want to or not.
So probably gonna look that text up later. Putmi, a correspondent of the newspaper Zemskina in the beginning of 1909, reported that the lodge Astrea resumed activities in St. Petersburg, and many of its members became top-ranking officials of the State Council and State Duma. Here we can see how Freemasonry just takes over a country. Wilensky Vesnik mentioned that attention to the curious observers could not be but drawn by both attempts to resurrect Freemasonry repressed in the country after the defeat of December 1825 rebellion and by the certain success of this attempt. From January 1st, 1908, Kristyakov began to publish a bi-monthly edition, The Russian Freemason, Svobodny Kamenchik. According to its program, this journal was dedicated to all seeking for genuine Johannine Freemasonry, consisting of 3 degrees. By the end of 1908, after this publication was stopped. in another weekly magazine published by Kristiakov, Rebus. The Rebus, we know what the Rebus is. This is this weird hermaphrodite creature. Appeared an invitation to join the circle of those who take interest in Freemasonry in the editorial office of the Rebus. The purpose was to learn Freemasonry in theory and practice. Kristiakov tried to legalize this circle, but the local authorities offered him to suspend legalization. After the Bolshevik Revolution, one of the leaders of the Cadets Central Committee from 1910 to 1917, Duke Obolensky, told about the secret society he had attended. He pointed out that before February 1917, this organization included one Bolshevik and several Jews, among them non-occupied high office. After finishing restructuring in 1913, the number of members in each lodge of the newly born Grand Orient of Russia's people, including a lodge in the State Duma, a lodge consisting of journalists, lodges in both capitals, Kiev, Poltava or Kremenchuk, Kharkov, Odessa, Tver, Samara, Yekaterinburg, Saratov, Minsk, Vitebsk, Nizhny, Tiflis, Kutaisi, Riga, Revel, Tallinn, Revel is Tallinn in Estonia, Vilno, now Vilnius, and Kovno in Lithuania were limited to 12 persons. If there were 40 members, they were advised to divide into 2 lodges of 7 members. Exception was made for the lodge led by Chermak and Rose Lodge in the State Duma. The total number of lodges made up 28 to 40 as a minimum. In St. Petersburg, 11 lodges included 95 persons. In Kiev, Ukraine, there were 7 lodges. Nizhny Novgorod and Moscow had 2 lodges. The total number of Masons under supervision of the Supreme Council reached 350 to 400. These may not seem to be many Masons, but we have to consider that they were mostly in the State Duma or in some other capacity of the Russian government, and hence were influential. In 1915, the number of lodges already reached 49 or 50, and the number of Freemasons 600, excluding those not under the authority of the Supreme Council of Martinists, Philaletes, Scottish Rite Masons, and Supreme Council numerous non-initiated activists. But Berberova suggests that there were many more. Her list of Freemasons in Russia contains 666 persons. Soviet authors state that there were much less. My opinion is that there were soon more than less, taking in account that the Cadets Party had the membership of 50,000 and was immediately banned by the Bolsheviks after their victory. It was banned also because the number of member of cadets was on par with the Bolsheviks. On the other hand, in the French Parliament that time, 200 of 600 deputies were Masons. 200 of 600 deputies were Freemasons. So in comparison with West Russian Masonry was never numerous. The recording of proceeding in lodges was forbidden. All lodges were issued orally. All lodges were strictly supervised by the Supreme Council of Russia's people formed in 1913. Worshipful masters of lodges only knew 3 secretaries of the Supreme Council: Nekrasov, Kerensky, Tereshchenko. Its full membership was kept in secrecy. The ruling members of the Supreme Council, called also a convent of Freemasons, initially formed in the summer of 1912, usually met not less than twice a month in St. Petersburg and Moscow, and the participants of these conferences were also ambassadors of France and Great Britain, Maurice, George Paleolog, and George Buchanan. The meetings of the Supreme Council were held in the homes of Ryabuzhinsky, Koskova, Prokopovich, Konalov, Chelnokov, Dolgorukov, Gushkov, in the homes of Orlov, Davidov, Fyodorov, Polovtsev, Möller, Tsakamelsky, and Gorky, as well as isolated rooms in 2 restaurants, Content and Odono in St. Petersburg. After the February Revolution, broke out the Supreme Council remained secret. Lady Mason Kuskova wrote to a Mason Volsky in 1955, "We had got our people everywhere. Such organizations as Free Economic Society, Technological Society were penetrated by them from inside." She further added, "Up to now the secrets of this organization have not been revealed, despite it was a huge organization. By the time the February Revolution had broken out, all Russia was covered by the thick network of the Masonic lodges. Many of its members are now here in emigration, but they all keep silence. They'll be keeping silence until all people who are living in Russia and participated in the Masonic lodges pass away." One of the most influential members of the Supreme Council was Duke Obolensky, leader of the St. Petersburg Regional Council. He belonged to the old and tested Masons who went through the school of Freemasonry in France, in lodges of Moscow, St. Petersburg and other major cities. Therefore, the ritual and degrees remained of great importance, as well as the ceremonies and rituals beginning from the certain level of initiation of a Mason. Participation in a variety of parties gave Russian Freemasonry an excellent opportunity to act in many directions, and in many fields at once. As Kerensky wrote, "We never allowed anybody to erode our solidarity." There were registered cases where Martinists and Masons of other rites were also involved in Supreme Council affairs. The Cadet Katisov, Major of Tiflis, Deputy of State Duma and the 33rd degree Mason, was asked in 1916 to influence the Grand Duke Romanov Nikolai Nikolaevich, he was close friend and also a Martinist, to agree to replace the acting emperor after the revolutionary. Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich was commander-in-chief of the Russian army in 1914 to 1915. Yeah, so every living Freemason is a traitor to whatever country he lives on, in theory, in practice, and in general. Because if the Freemasons and their hidden fathers decide that, oh, now we don't like this state, we must overthrow it, the Masons will work to overthrow it. And they will say that they are not political and they will lie like hyenas. A list of ministers of the future provisional government was discussed and agreed beforehand at the apartment of Kuskova and was slightly amended in 1916 at the apartment of Duke Lvov and the Suite of France Hotel in St. Petersburg. Approximately half of the places in provisional government were taken by Masons from the Supreme Council of Russia's people nominated for their posts in the previously compiled list long before 2nd March of 1917. The first cabinet of the provisional government included 9 brothers and only 1 profane, Pavel Nikolaevich Milyukov. Kerensky was being specially trained for his future post. Some members of the Supreme Council also managed to participate in the new Soviet Bolshevik cabinet. Some cooperated in the trade organizations of the USSR like Tereshchenko and Nekrasov permanently. After the Bolshevik Revolution of the Supreme Council of Russia's people was organized into Free Russia Lodge. Soon it became a society for mutual aid for immigrants. New attempts to revive the organization were made at the beginning of 1918 by Freemason Isayev in St. Petersburg and Freemason Znamensky in Vladivostok in the period of existence there of the independent Far Eastern Republic, as well as the initiative Vasilenko, worshipful master of the Kiev Lodge Astreya. The Kiev Freemasons changed the title of the organization from the Grand Orient of Russia's people to the Masonry of the Eastern people. The members of the lodges were Odine, Skoropadsky, Petliura, okay, I'm butchering these names. After their death in 1920, this lodge Truth was incorporated under the Grand People's Lodge of Poland. In the summer of 1919, some members of the former Supreme Council met in Paris and decided to recreate the organization in exile. Lots of names that I don't want to read. The Grand Orient of France never recognized these new lodges as regular and never contacted them. Of course not. As a result of this,
were anti-Masonic campaigns in the Soviet Union. They started at the same time when Stalin started purging Lenin's old guard to cement his rule. So basically it was more or less the same process. The French Freemasonry was a kind of separate system of power and relationships from the Soviet government, and Stalin very much liked when the Freemasons undermined the Russian state, but he didn't like when they were able to undermine the Soviet state, so there were harsh repressions against the Masons. In this, Stalin was very much like Napoleon, who also wasn't a Mason himself, but gave them some protection, and he enjoyed what they were doing. There is some comment he made while he was imprisoned that he thought that Freemasons were a pile of imbeciles, but that they still carried out good actions. So I think, and in the absurd conclusions of official Masonic history, it is said that between the Bolsheviks and the other socialists there was some kind of impenetrable wall. Like inside, among the Mensheviks, there was a lot of Freemasons, and on the other side, none, which is just stupid. And this is in the faction led by Lenin, who even among his own was counted as a Machiavellian genius who had no principles. Like, why wouldn't he put on an apron and just get the bonus connections and protection among Western socialism? This is, of course, very stupid. Some people say that even Lenin personally hated Masons, but there is literally no proof of this. From people like Lenin, when he hates someone, you can read dozens or hundreds of mentions of them in his letters, in his articles, but the word Mason simply doesn't appear in his complete works. In 55 tomes of the complete works of Lenin, you won't find any mention of Masons. And I think this is more proof that he was one and that he wasn't one, you know? And of course, social democracy cannot work outside Masonry. So non-Masonic socialism doesn't exist. Socialism appeared as a Masonic system, and its rituals, symbols, rhetoric, it is still a Masonic system. It's all international organizations were organized in Masonic style, and the Comintern, the Sotsintern, and the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, which grew out of the Bolsheviks, was of course no exception. Everyone agrees, all historians agree, that the leadership of all left-wing parties in Russia was full of Masons. The Social Democrats, the Social Revolutionaries, the Constitutional Democrats, and for some reason it is claimed that there were none among the Bolsheviks. This doesn't make sense, because there was no impenetrable wall between the Bolsheviks and the other left-wing groups. Even after 1917, like more than half of the Bolsheviks were former members of non-Bolshevik parties and fractions. So Lenin wasn't even a Bolshevik. He had a huge fight with the original Bolsheviks, and he created his own party of Leninists. And right before the revolution, Lenin was fighting with the people who a few months later would become his closest associates. And of course, it is more or less impossible to imagine a socialist who is a socialist leader who is not a Mason. It is often said that within the provisional government in Russia after the February Revolution, there was only one person who was not a socialist, and that is Pavel Milukov. But in a completely socialist government, it is impossible to find one of these Milukovs who is not a Mason. And it is very strange that it is claimed that there were literally no Masons among the Bolsheviks. Some of them are proven upon dozens of scientific crazy Mesopotamian temple style. The decorative aprons, which have no basis in Russian national culture. Member of a lodge called Art and Labor, a French lodge that he joined in 1908. But it would be very easy to just acknowledge that, I don't know, Bukharin or Zinoviev or one of those people who were purged was a Mason, and that was just the exception that proved the rule. But no, they literally claim that there was not a single Mason among the Bolsheviks, which is extremely suspicious, I think you'd agree. And for some reason, the serious analysis of the USSR as a Masonic state is still forbidden. And all those hammers, all those ties, the red corners, the mausoleums in Babylonian, Egyptian style, the decorative aprons, which have no basis in Russian national culture at all, are still considered some kind of spontaneous creation of revolutionary workers. This is just laughable, really. And considering the mausoleum, it is a very interesting topic. Maybe you know, maybe you don't, but the mausoleum, as the Lenin mausoleum, as it is currently standing on Red Square, it is the third one. There were two before it. The first one was kind of a wooden shack. It looked very embarrassing, really, and it was swiftly demolished. And then they built a second wooden mausoleum, which was also a ziggurat, and it looked the most Babylonian of all. It was even more crazy Mesopotamian temple style than the current granite mausoleum. And of course, the mausoleum is only, you can see, is only a small part. There are like 10 or 12 levels underground, where they have a lot of stuff going on. They had a lot of work research going on. And the research was very interesting. They were looking for ways to preserve Lenin's corpse, and in the meanwhile, they stumbled upon dozens of scientific innovations. They went through hundreds of corpses trying to figure out a method, and it's a very crazy story. There was a lot of weird stuff going on underground there. There was a lot of research of this kind going on and things, but he said, the gist of what he said was that they can't open them simply because the information actually for the opposite is that when you tell someone something under the rose, it is in secret, and he cannot tell it someone else through the Greek-Roman culture. You know, just look, for example, at the symbolism of social democracy. You know, the symbol of socialism is a hand holding a rose, a clenched fist holding a rose, actually. It tightly wraps around this rose, and the rose, of course, is the symbol of silence and the symbol of revenge for divulging secrets. There is this old expression, sub rosa, under the rose. It means that when you tell someone something under the rose, it is in secret, and he cannot tell it someone else he will be punished. And inside the socialist fist that holds the rose, of course, if you take a rose like this and clench it in your fist, then your hand is going to get bloodied. Inside the fist oozes blood. And this means that anyone who reveals the true secret of socialism will die. And in the meanwhile, for the uninitiated, for the profane, it's just a harmless little flower. Because this is the meaning of a real symbol. It should always have two meanings, a profane one and one for the initiated. And in the best case, these meanings should be completely opposed to each other, have nothing to do with each other. And the religious character of socialism can be seen with the naked eye. It is very good at disguising itself as scientific knowledge, though. Much better than modern religions like Catholicism, because when it uses scientific language and syllogisms and stuff like that, it still talks about miracles and the will of God and whatever. But social democrats say that there are no miracles and no gods. But still, when they gather and they wear their aprons and robes and stupid hats and what so on behind closed doors, and they prostrate themselves before these new gods, and they prostrate themselves so hard that they smash in their Masonic skulls, And this God, it's not Jesus or Allah. The rose, the socialist rose, was also an attribute of a Roman festival, the Day of the Dead, the Rosalia. And the one goddess who was especially venerated on Rosalia was Flora. Flora, you know, as in flora and fauna. And coincidentally, the cult of Flora was soon replaced with the cult of Fauna. And Fauna was actually a nameless and faceless goddess. She was only known as the daughter of Faun. Her name wasn't Fauna, she was just called this because in the mythology she was the daughter of Faun. And Fauna's feast day, the day of Rosalia.
So I found an interesting article by Leo Sogami on Ukraine and Freemasonry. Unprecedented clash between Ukrainian and Russian Freemasonry and the secrets of Russian Masonry. By Leo Sogami. Interviewed by the Italian news agency ADN Kronos, the Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Ukraine, Anatoly Dimitruk, said that traditionally as Masons we cannot support war, tyranny, moral and physical violence. It is impossible on a metaphysical level. We, the Freemasons, as citizens of Ukraine, actively fight against it. The Freemasonry recognizes as the borders of a state those recognized by the various international institutions and by the government, unless it is a totalitarian state, given that during totalitarian regimes Freemasonry has always been persecuted, as demonstrated by what happened in Imperial Russia and Soviet Russia. This hints, of course, as the age-old feud that the Freemasons have with Russia, because Tsar Alexander I and Catherine II before him actually banned Russian Freemasonry, and the Russians, the Freemasons, are very butthurt over this. So let me continue. However, the history of Freemasonry in Russia is a bit more complex than that and completely intertwined with the history of Russia over the last 300 years. Speculative Masonry was originally brought to Russia in early part of the 18th century by foreign officers in service to the Russian military, and Catherine the Great's factotum Ivan Yelagin succeeded in reorganizing Russian Freemasonry into a far-reaching nationwide system and secured at the same time the English authorization for the first regular Russian Grand Lodge, becoming also its provincial Grand Master. According to Albert Mackey, the tendency was mystical and the influence on society negligible. Russia was later recognized also as the 8th autonomous province of the right of strict observance, but after the French Revolution, anti-Masonic measures started to creep in, as well as a schism developed between the lodges of Moscow, dominated by the strict observance, and St. Petersburg, ruled instead by the Swedish Rite. In the meantime, Catherine the Great, the last reigning Empress of Russia from 1762 till 1796, and the country's longest ruling female leader, suspected the Freemasons had turned her son Paul against her, becoming a tool in the hands of her main enemy, the King of Prussia. And viewed their attitude towards women as backwards. When Paul I came to the throne, he initially supported Masonry, but quickly changed his mind once he became Tsar, largely out of fear over the French Revolution and the alleged role Masonry had in it, / the Jacobites and all these idiots. He outlawed the fraternity in 1796, along with all other suspected secret societies in the country. The Order of Freemasons became a quasi-forbidden thing in Russia. Even in the period of the golden age of Russian Masonry from 1810 till 1822, the lodges were under very strict surveillance by the Special Office of the Ministry of Home Affairs, making it a quasi-state institution like it's considered today also by the Ukrainian Grand Master. So the Ukrainian Grand Master thinks that the Russian Freemasons are Putin-controlled, and of course this is probably true, and if I were Putin I would also do this. I would, make sure that pretty loyal people infiltrate the stupid government within the government, the Masons, and basically feel the pulse of the transnational transatlantic brothers and what they do. So two large competing Grand Lodges formed, the Swedish Provincial Grand Lodge of Russia with 7 lodges and the Grand Lodge of Austria with 19 lodges. This is the period of Freemasonry depicted in Tolstoy's novel of the Napoleonic period, War and Peace. Under Nicholas II, the last Tsar of Russia, Freemasonry was eventually legalized and enjoyed a brief revival only after the First Russian Revolution of 1905 and the October Manifesto of 1905 that granted limited rights to unions and private meetings. This period saw the birth of the Grand Orient of Russia's Peoples, GOORP, an illegal co-Freemasonry political organization that existed in Russia from 1912 till 1917. Built with the help of the French Illuminati that seceded, however, from the Grand Orient de France, with Nikolai Vissarionovich Nekrasov and Alexander Fyodorovich Kerensky as its main leaders, as well as Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, better known as his alias Lenin, founder of the Russian Communist Party or Bolsheviks, inspirer and leader of the Bolshevik Revolution that he put into motion after conveniently closing all the lodges in 1917. Lenin was also a member of the known French Masonic lodge L'Union de Belleville, Belleville of course meaning Paris, a communist lodge that was used by Illuminati to recruit influential political figures like Lenin and supported in the past the Paris Commune, a revolutionary government that seized power in Paris, the capital of France, from 18th March to 28th of May 1871. Debates over the policies and outcome of the Commune had also a significant influence on the ideas of both Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, who described it as the first example of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Lenin and the Grand Orient of the Russian peoples inspired Russian brothers to try and take high places in state bodies and diplomatic military circles. They had their people in the French embassy, State Council, Progressist bloc of the State Duma, Cadet, Oktyabrist, Trudovik, Labourist parties and factions, working groups of Military Industrial Council, General Staff, Moscow State Duma, Commerce and Industry Alliance, the Bar, Professorship of St. Petersburg, Moscow universities. Freemasons were especially active in the 4th State Duma, where they formed the Progressist bloc in summer 1915 and tried to form the bloc comprising all opposition parties to eliminate the monarchy in Russia following the original plan of the Illuminati. Going back to the words of criticism recently made towards the Grand Lodge of Russia by the Ukrainian Grand Master Dimitruk, he has explained that he is working on distributing aid to the exhausted population thanks to the commitment of many volunteers, including goods that come from Masonic organizations and obediences around the world. He then said that he was proud of his Ukrainian brothers who have trusted their Masonic oaths and their civic duties towards the homeland. Ukrainian Grand Master Anatoly Dimitruk has lashed out at his Russian colleague Andrei Bogdanov, the Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Russia, claiming that in the past 2014 he had posted on his Facebook profile exhortations to divide or invade Ukraine, noting that Bogdanov was running for president within the Russian Communist Party, whose activists are traditionally atheist, while Freemasons cannot be atheists. The Ukrainian Grand Master then said that he does not believe that the Russian Masonic Lodge is free because the Russian Federation is a totalitarian regime. We have information that the Russian Masonic Lodge has been supported in the past by the Kremlin, as well as having learned from the conversations of the Russian Freemasons expelled that the Russian Masonic Grand Lodge is supported by the Kremlin and in particular by Surkov, an entrepreneur and Putin-trusted advisor for years. The Ukrainian Grand Master then specified that there is no mutual recognition between the two Masonic institutions, as they were the first to disown us, consequently we did too. Vladislav Yurievich Surkov, who is said to be the current leader of the Russian Illuminati, also known as Putin's Rasputin, the Grey Cardinal of the Kremlin or the Puppet Master, and as the BBC says, one of the most powerful and influential men you ever heard, is the real secret chief of Russian Freemasonry and the supreme architect of Russia's ideology of sovereign democracy or managed democracy and the conflict in eastern Ukraine. This was confirmed in October 2016 by the Ukrainian hacker group Cyber Hunter, which leaked over a gigabyte of emails and other documents alleged to belonging to Russian political operative and senior Kremlin official. The Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Russia, Bogdanov, reported on the Facebook page of the Grand Lodge of Russia that he had been contacted by the news agency ADN Kronos to hear, as they say in Masonic jargon, his bell, and to have replied that no, I will not comment on the political statement of my brother Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Ukraine in order not to violate our Masonic constitution. I can only say that the Grand Lodge of Russia is registered with the Ministry of the Justice of Russian Federation, which respects the Constitution of Russian Federation and observes the Anderson Masonic Constitution. In its existence since 1995, the state has never intervened in the affairs of the Grand Lodge of Russia. I can specify that today, in the context of the regular and recognized world of Freemasonry, it remains one of the few bridges between Western civilization and Russia. Blah blah. Bogdanov and Smirnov are funny and very creative political strategists with good knowledge of internet technologies. Blah blah blah. More on Freemasonry in Ukraine, the main stages of development. This is a political paper. Who has written it? Reva Tetiana, PhD in Politics, Associate Professor of the Social Sciences Chair, National Academy of Managerial Staff of Culture and Arts. Freemasonry in Ukraine, the main stages of development. Freemasonry as a political and social phenomenon is viewed. The main version of Freemason origins and its typology are reviewed. The main symbols of the Freemason and their meanings are characterized. The historic links of the Freemasonry with different churches and state authority are analyzed. The stages of Ukrainian Freemasonry development and its political orientation centuries are highlighted. This is in Cyrillian language. I can't read this, sadly. Freemasonry is a complicated phenomenon because there's no single definition of it in the humanitarian science. Yeah, they completely exclude everything about the Masons from these so-called social sciences and political science in order to conceal the hidden hand of Masonry. The development of Freemasonry and its impact in the cultural sphere are analyzed by many Ukrainian and foreign scientists. The origins of Freemasonry, its main features, are reviewed by J. Anderson, Borovoy, Pipin, Robinson, and others. Many Ukrainian scientists such as Yefremov, Khodorovska, Sasinoy, Krishanovsky devoted their researches to the development of Freemasonry movement in Ukraine. The issue of the main stages and variety of Ukrainian Freemasonry are considered by Soloviev, Kravtsev and Olobin. There is no single approach to this issue in the modern science, so this question is still on the agenda for history of Ukraine. The goal of the article is to analyze the main stages of Freemasonry's development in Ukraine. To reach the goal of the article, we have to do such tasks as to review different approaches to the definition of Freemasonry and versions of its origins, to analyze the main stages of Freemasonry's development in Ukraine. Freemasonry is an international religious and philosophical movement created by combining 4 London lodges into the Great Lodge in 1717. Freemasonry is a cosmopolitan religious and ethical movement. Masonry is the practice of the secret fraternal order. It is a moral and ethical movement. Its main goal is the education influence on the system of state authority. I repeat, its main goal is the educational influence on the system of the state authority. There are many versions of the origins of Freemasonry in history. Some of them romanticize this movement, others mystify it, blah blah blah. Yefremov, the famous Ukrainian historian, philologist, distinguishes two stages of Masonry. They are operative and speculative. The operative Freemasonry existed until the 16th century as a professional association of builders. In the 16th century, it became the speculative, or am I reading this correct? Now, in the 18th century, it became the speculative or theoretical and symbolic movement. The official date of its transformation is considered to be the 24th of July 1717. That day in London, in the pub under the apple tree, the representatives of the four Freemasonry lodges united and formed the Great Lodge of England, or the Mother Great Lodge of England. At that meeting, they elected the first Grand Master. The Masonic ideas differed from traditional religious provisions in many aspects. The Masonic recognition that Eden was in heaven, but the purpose of their activities was to build it on land. They advocated the creation of a perfect society based on justice, equality, fraternity, blah, 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 blah. There are two systems of Freemasonry. They are St. John and St. Andrew. St. John, or Blue, is called in honor of John the Baptist. This system has three levels: Master, Apprentice, and Junior. St. Andrew, or Red, is called in honor of St. Andrew. It consists of 33 levels. It has a variety of rituals. The followers of this system call themselves the Knights of the Kind Action. Many different secret societies are associated with Freemasons, but they are not Masons. They are the Rosicrucians, the Illuminati, the Martinisti, the Martinists, basically, the Irrational or Egyptian Masons. The Irrational Masons. The Rosicrucians, named after Rosicrucians, a German philosopher, traveled to 14th century. They promoted the ideas of Eastern religious magic cults such as Kabbalism and looked for the philosopher's stone. In the 18th century, the Golden Rosicrucians announced their degree of initiation is the highest in Freemasonry because they knew key features of divine wisdom. The Rosicrucians considered themselves the elite of Freemasonry. The Illuminati, or Enlightened, were founded in 1775 by Adam Weishaupt, a German theologian, Jesuit, and naturalist. They advocate the revision of social relations and the abolition of social inequality. Where have we heard that? Weren't they founded in like May Day? Anyway, in 1784, the authorities' response on such activities became mass repressions against the Illuminati and punishment for communication and cooperation with them. The results of that policy were the decline of the order and a bad reputation in society. The order of the Martinists is the philosophical system of Saint Martin, a French mystic of the 18th century. Ancros, a French mystic known under the pen name Papius, became inactive in its follower. In Paris in 1891, he created the order Supérieur Inconnu, known as the Martinists, Superior Inconnu, so the better unknown people. It has been acting since that time. They are not a Masonic society, but actively cooperate with various lodges. Irrational, or Egyptian Masonry, was established by Earl Cagliostro, or his other name Earl Saint-Germain. It is characterized by a large number of Freemasonry rites, mysticism, and a complex of internal organization. The discussions concerning the relationship of Freemasonry with the Church and the State started from the beginning of the Masonic movement. Mason status changed from a legal association to an extremist organization. Everything depended on the social and political situation in the country and the role of the Church in it. In modern world space, this discussion continues. The operational Freemasonry wasn't persecuted by the official authorities and the Church because it was the professional association of builders which took part in the construction of churches and secular buildings. Everything changed in the 18th century when the intellectual elite joined these companies and began spreading the idea of equality, solidarity, and freedom and brotherhood in society. Yeah, now society is divided. So in western Ukraine, the first powerful lodges appeared in Lvov. In 1747, the Lodge of Three Goddesses was established there, but under the Catholic Church's pressure it was destroyed. There were two large Masons organizations in Lvov at the end of the 18th century. They were the Lodge of the Three White Eagles, headed by J. Clemens, and the Lodge of Entire Equality, headed by Nowakovsky. In 1767, the Austrian government created It's not that the Masons created it, the government created it. The government of Austria created the Lodge of Three White Eagles in Ukraine. It acted until 1782. Its political tasks, and here you can see again, under themselves, the Masons admit that they do political tasks. Lodges are created for specific political tasks. Its political tasks were to negotiate and to facilitate the links between the Austrian authorities and the local gentry. We can see looking for the membership of the Three White Eagles. Total quantity of the lodge was 115 people, 69 of them were representatives of Austria's military or civil servants. Galicia had its 40 representatives, bankers, priests, noblemen, businessmen. The other represented the third state. For example, Auersberg, the governor of Galicia, and Ichard, the head of Lvov region, were the members of the lodge. The local nobility and bourgeoisie dominated the Lodge of Entire Equality, of course, because we're all equal if we're for the nobility. So the lodge consists of 51 members, 37 of them were magnates and local noblemen. There were only 3 Austrians. The Lodge of Entire Equality proclaimed itself the Great East of Galicia and Lodomeria. There were 2 types of masonry in Ukraine. They are Polish and Russian. The Polish one had the political character since its foundation. The main objective of that association were the restoration of Poland in its historical borders. So we can see again here, some countries, they are deemed good for the Masons, and if they are allowed to be nationalist, and this is only to weaken another nation which they dislike, like for example Russia or Germany. Whereas also in these nations, Masonry has a very different character that is openly Christian as far as it can. We can also read this in Ludendorff and in many other people from earlier times, that basically in Russia and in Germany and Prussia, he has explained that he is working on distributing aid to the exhausted population thanks to the commitment of many volunteers, including goods that come from Masonic organizations and obediences around the world. He then said he was proud of my Ukrainian brothers who have trusted their Masonic oaths and their civic duties towards the homeland. End quote. Ukrainian Grandmaster Anatoly Dimchuk then lashed out at his Russian colleague Andrei Bogdanov, the Grandmaster of the Grand Lodge of Russia, claiming that in the past, in 2014, he had posted on his Facebook profile exhortations to divide or invade Ukraine, noting that Bogdanov was running for president with the Russian Communist Party, whose activities are traditionally atheist. Is this the Nazbol party, I think? While Freemasons cannot be atheists. The Ukrainian Grandmaster then said that he does not believe that the Russian Masonic Lodge is free because the Russian Federation is a totalitarian regime, and we have information that the Russian Masonic Lodge has been supported in the past by the Kremlin, or supported, controlled, which I find a good thing, you know. I want the Masons to be controlled by Russia. As well as having learned from the conversations of the Russian Freemasons expelled that the Russian Masonic Grand Lodge is supported by the Kremlin and in particular by Surkov, an entrepreneur and Putin's trusted advisor for years. So we know that Putin keeps tabs on what the Masons are doing. The Ukrainian Grand Master then specified that there is no mutual recognition between the two Masonic institutions, as they were the first to disown us. Consequently, we did disown the Russians too. Vladislav Yuryevich Surkov, who is said to be the current leader of the Russian Illuminati, also known as Putin's Rasputin, the Grey Cardinal of the Kremlin, or the Puppet Master, and as the BBC says, one of the most powerful men you have ever heard of, is the real secret chief of Russian Freemasonry and the supreme architect of Russia's ideology of sovereign democracy or managed democracy and the conflict in eastern Ukraine. So anyway, I'm not gonna say that I'm in favor of even that, you know, like, I think all of Masonry should be destroyed completely. It should be rooted out like a weed and make sure that its roots never take hold again. Managed democracy and the conflict in eastern Ukraine. This was confirmed in October 2016 by the Ukrainian hacker group CyberHunta, which leaked over a gigabyte of emails and other documents alleged to belonging to Russian political operative and senior Kremlin official. The Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Russia, Bogdanov, reported on the Facebook page of the Grand Lodge of Russia that he had been contacted by the news agency ADN Kronos to hear, as they say in the Masonic jargon, his bell, and to have replied that, "No, I will not comment on the political statement of my brother Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Ukraine in order not to violate our Masonic constitution. I can only say that the Grand Lodge of Russia is registered with the Ministry of Justice of the Russian Federation, which respects the constitution of the Russian Federation and observes the Anderson Masonic constitution. In its existence since 1995, the state has never intervened in the affairs of the Grand Lodge of Russia. I can specify today, in the context of the regular and recognized world of Freemasonry, it remains one of the few bridges between Western civilization and Russia. We appreciate that very much. I very much hope that fraternal harmony will be maintained in regular international Freemasonry despite all the challenges of the world." So Bogdanov and Smirnov are funny and creative political strategists, quote unquote, with good knowledge of internet technologies, said once political consultant Dmitry Fetisov to RBC, and he was right. Smirnov and Bogdanov have worked together since the 1990s. In 1991, Smirnov headed the executive committee of the TPR Youth Union, whose head was Bogdanov. In 1996, Smirnov became the director of the Department of Regional Political Programs of the Information and Analytical Center Novocom, and in 1997 Bogdanov took over as vice president of the center. Before the 2008 presidential elections, both political strategists were in the top 3 of the DPR federal list. Bogdanov also took part in the elections, but not from the party but the Initiative Group of Citizens, receiving 1.3% of the vote and taking last place. In 2018, Vladimir Putin asked Grandmaster Andrei Bogdanov and political strategist Vyacheslav Smirnov not to participate in the presidential elections to avoid the carnivalization of the 2018 campaign. Experts say he was, of course, about to be re-elected. The Grand Lodge of Russia operates to this day just like the Russian Orthodox Church for the interest of the Russian Federation, and Grandmaster Andrei Vladimirovich Bogdanov is just as supportive of the military operation in Ukraine as Kirill, the primate of the Russian Orthodox Church. Vladislav Surkov worked for years behind the scenes to make sure the foreign Masonic interest will never again interfere with Russia as it happened in the past. However, the French Illuminati seem to have planted the seeds of a future revolution. When in March 2001, about 100 Freemasons left the Grand Lodge of Russia to later form the United Grand Lodge of Russia, or UGLR, under the patronage of the Grand Lodge of France. On the 2nd of July 2019, the UGLR counted 200 Freemasons united in 11 lodges, and the current Grand Master of the UGLR is Yuri Arkhangelsky, who might be working behind the scenes to sabotage Putin, just like the Grand Orient of Russia's people and Lenin did with Nikolai II, Alexandrovich Romanov, the last emperor of Russia. So on Wikipedia we find on the International Order of Saint Stanislaus. The International Order of Saint Stanislaus, I can't spell this, is a Polish fraternal order founded on 16th May 2004. Although claiming to follow the code of chivalry, it acknowledges itself as a recently founded private organization without fount of honor or no legitimate order of chivalry. In doing so, the organization frankly acknowledges the problems with its background organization, Ordo Sancti Stanislai, founded by Julius Nowina Sokolniki in 1979 as an attempted revival of the Polish Order of Saint Stanislaus, in turn founded 1765. The International Order of Saint Stanislaus is a fraternal order. It has been compared to the Masonic movement. Background. In 1979, Julius Nowina Sokolniki and the Polish exile group, claiming to be the legitimate government founded by the Ordo Sancta Stanislai, attempting to revive the Polish Order of Saint Stanislaus, founded in 1765 as an order of knighthood of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, since it had been incorporated by the Russian Empire in 1831 as the Order of Saint Stanislaus of the Imperial House of Romanov. However, the management of the new organization resulted in several claimed successor movements. During the 1990s, disputes with Julius Nowina Sokolniki caused several national subgroups of this organization called priories to break away. In 2004, several of the existing national priories of the Ordo Sancti Stanislai joined together to create the International Order of Saint Stanislaus as an alliance of national groups. The Order of Saint Stanislaus was established on the feast of the Bishop and Martyr Saint Stanislaus on the 8th May of 1765 by King Stanislaus II Augustus Poniatowski, the last native king of the Commonwealth of the Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. The Order of Saint Stanislaus was established in the spirit of the Age of Enlightenment to collect enlightened men around the king. The goal was to encourage the development of a modern, socially enlightened country. To find a link between the medieval and new enlightened Poland, King Stanislaus Poniatowski chose his titular saint, the Bishop and Martyr Saint Stanislaus, the old patron of Krakow and Poland, as the patron of his new order. To encourage the new knights, he chose the motto Praemiando incitat, what means encouraged by rewarding. It was a single-class order and the highest award and honor after the Order of the White Eagle, which was previously established in 1325. After the third and last partition of the old Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in 1795 between Russia, Austria and Prussia, the Order of Saint Stanislaus fell into abeyance. As a result of Napoleon's victories and freed from occupation, the central area of Poland was created into the Duchy of Warsaw under Frederick Augustus I, King of Saxony, who became the second Grand Master, renewing the bestowal of the Order of Saint Stanislaus. He added a second white stripe to the border of the sash. Tsar Alexander I as the Third Tsar Alexander I as the third Grand Master of the Order of Saint Stanislaus. I can't spell this. Divided the order into 4 classes, and the condition to receive a higher class was to have already received the lower class. With the Russian Revolution, Tsar Nicholas II was forced to abdicate in March 1917. The Order of Saint Stanislaus once again fell into abeyance. Anyway, on the 9th June of 1779, the Order of Saint Stanislaus was re-established in 5 classes by Julius Nowina Sokolniki, one of the 2 former legitimate Polish governments in exile, which was based in London. Upon establishment in 1979, the first diploma of the Order of Saint Stanislaus, along with the Grand Cross and sash, were placed at the shrine of Our Lady of Częstochowa in Poland, most sacred shrine. Later, the second diploma of the Order of Saint Stanislaus, together with the Grand Cross and sash, were presented to His Holiness the Pope John Paul II. His Holiness wished the order well, and the decoration that was presented to him is now on display at the Royal Castle in Krakow. Jan Zbigniew Potocki followed Julius Nowiny Sokolniki as the 9th Grand Master of the Order in August 2009. He was dismissed from his position as Grand Master in 2010 after he violated the constitution of the Order repeatedly. He never recognized this decision. The Order was then governed by the Regency Council internationally.
So, the primordial interest of the United States, over which for a century we have fought wars, the First, Second Cold War, has been the relationship between Germany and Russia, because united they are the only force that could threaten us, and to make sure that that doesn't happen. For the United States, the primordial fear is Russian capital, Russian technology, German technology and German capital, Russian natural resources, Russian manpower, as the only combination that has for centuries scared the hell out of the United States.
Ванька, Станька, що